There is a kind of music that moves like water, slow and winding, carrying with it the voices of 1,000 nights, the laughter spilling from dimly lit doorways, the hum of a city that never quite sleeps, and the heartbeat of something ancient and new all at once. It begins somewhere deep in memory, in the place where sound becomes feeling, where a single note can stretch across an entire room and fill it with longing or joy, or the bittersweet ache of something beautiful passing by. Tonight, I find myself walking through the story of this music, this art form that has no single birthplace, no moment when it sprang fully formed into the world, but rather emerged slowly, like dawn breaking over the Mississippi Delta, like the first stars appearing over the streets of New Orleans, gradual and inevitable and utterly transformative. The air feels thick with history, humid with the breath of generations, and if I listen carefully, I can almost hear it, the distant echo of work songs drifting across fields, the rhythmic pulse of drums that remember a different shore, the interweaving melodies of cultures colliding and conversing in the vibrant chaos of a port city where anything seems possible. This music, jazz, it doesn't arrive with fanfare or announcement. It seeps into existence like groundwater finding its way to the surface, pooling in the places where people gather, where they celebrate and mourn, where they transform their sorrow into something transcendent and their joy into something that can be shared. I imagine the streets at twilight, gas lamps casting their warm glow on cobblestones worn smooth by countless footsteps, the sound of a cornet cutting through the evening air, clear and bright and entirely itself, playing a melody that sounds familiar and utterly new at the same time, bending notes in ways that make the heart lean forward, curious, captivated. There are moments when music becomes more than entertainment, more than background, when it becomes the very language through which a community speaks its truth, its pain, its resilience, its refusal to be silenced or diminished, and jazz, from its earliest whispers, has been that kind of music, born from the collision of African rhythms and European harmonies, shaped by the spirituals sung in churches and the field hollers that marked time in the brutal heat of the day, refined in the dance halls and honky-tonks, where people came to forget their troubles, or at least to dance with them for a while. The geography matters here, the way certain cities become crucibles, places where the right combination of people and circumstances creates something that cannot be replicated. New Orleans, sitting at the mouth of the great river, a city of countless influences, French and Spanish and Caribbean and African, all swirling together in a cultural gumbo so rich that it births entirely new forms of expression. I think about the instruments themselves, the way a trumpet can sound like a human voice, full of vibrato and emotion, the way a clarinet can weave arabesques of sound that seem to spiral upward into the night, the deep thrum of a bass that holds everything together, anchoring the conversation, providing the foundation upon which improvisation can build its momentary cathedrals, because that's what jazz is, at its core, a conversation, a dialogue between musicians who listen as much as they play, who respond to each other in real time, creating something that has never existed before and will never exist again in quite the same way. The music carries within it the memory of struggle, the weight of history, but also an irrepressible spirit of innovation, of making something beautiful out of whatever materials are at hand, of turning limitation into creativity, of saying yes to possibility even when the world seems determined to say no. And so, as the evening deepens, as the streetlights flicker on one by one, I prepare to follow this music through time, to trace its evolution from those early days when it was just beginning to find its voice, through decades of transformation and reinvention, watching it spread from the dance halls of New Orleans to the concert halls of the world, always changing, always itself, a river of sound that never stops flowing. The story begins, as so many American stories do, with the convergence of cultures that had no intention of meeting, with the forced migration of millions of African people across an ocean they never wished to cross, carrying with them musical traditions that would prove impossible to extinguish, rhythms and call and response patterns that lived in the body, in the memory, in the soul. In the fields and on the plantations of the American South, music became a lifeline, a way to communicate, to preserve identity, to maintain humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Work songs matched the rhythm of labor, transforming the monotony of physical toil into something bearable, something communal, while spirituals spoke of deliverance and dignity, often encoding messages that the enslaved could understand, but their oppressors could not. These traditions carried within them the DNA of what would become jazz, the polyrhythmic complexity of West African drumming, the practice of improvisation, the concept of music as a participatory experience rather than a passive performance. All of this survived, adapted, and waited for the right moment to transform into something new. The moment, or rather the gradual unfolding, began in earnest in New Orleans, a city unlike any other in 19th century America. French and Spanish colonial influences had created a more fluid racial hierarchy than existed elsewhere in the South, and the city's position as a major port meant a constant influx of musical ideas from the Caribbean, from Europe, from South America, all mixing in the humid air along with the smell of chicory coffee and river water. In Congo Square, a public space where enslaved people were permitted to gather on Sunday afternoons, African musical traditions were performed openly. Drums, spoken languages remembered from across the ocean, dances maintained their connection to ancestral practices, and this cultural persistence would prove crucial, keeping alive the rhythmic sophistication and improvisational spirit that would later infuse jazz with its distinctive character after emancipation occurred in the late 1800s. New Orleans became a hothouse for musical experimentation. Black musicians, many of whom had served in military bands during the Civil War, found themselves with instruments and training, but few opportunities in a society determined to maintain white supremacy through other means. And so they played where they could, in the streets, in saloons, at picnics and parades and funerals. The brass band tradition flourished particularly in New Orleans. These ensembles would march through the streets, playing for social clubs and benevolent societies, and especially for funerals, developing the tradition of the jazz funeral, where somber dirges accompanied the deceased to the cemetery. But on the return journey, the music would transform into jubilant celebration, a musical acknowledgement of death and life intertwined, sorrow and joy inseparable. In these brass bands, something new was happening, Musicians began to embellish the written melodies, adding their own flourishes and variations, bending notes in ways that classical European training would never permit, playing what would come to be called blue notes, flatted thirds and sevenths that gave the music its emotional depth, its connection to the blues, that other great wellspring of African American musical innovation. The blues had been developing in parallel, primarily in the Mississippi Delta, a music of solo singers accompanying themselves on guitar or piano, telling stories of hardship and heartbreak, of leaving and longing, of small moments of pleasure in difficult lives. And the blues brought to the emerging jazz its harmonic structure, its emotional directness, its unflinching honesty about the human condition. Ragtime, too, was part of the mixture. Scott Joplin and other composers had created a pianistic style that syncopated European march rhythms, placing accents in unexpected places, creating a bouncing, propulsive feel that made people want to move, want to dance. And Ragtime's sophisticated compositional approach showed that black musicians could master European formal structures while simultaneously subverting and transforming them. In the dance halls and social clubs of Storyville, New Orleans' legal red light district from 1897 to 1917, pianists played ragtime and blues, while small ensembles began to develop a looser, more collectively improvised approach to popular songs and dance numbers. This wasn't yet called jazz. The term wouldn't come into common usage for several more years, but the music was finding its form, its voice, its grammar. The instrumentation was beginning to settle into recognizable patterns. A front line of cornet, clarinet, and trombone, playing interwoven melodic lines in a polyphonic texture where each instrument had its own voice, its own role in the conversation. The cornet typically carried the melody. The clarinet wove ornate counter-melodies above, and the trombone provided punctuation and harmonic support below, while behind them a rhythm section of piano, banjo or guitar, bass, and drums kept time and supplied the harmonic foundation. One of the legendary figures from this period, a man named Buddy Bolden, played cornet with such power and distinctive style that he became the talk of the city. Though no recordings of his playing survive, the stories persist, descriptions of how he could play so loudly that he could be heard across town, how he drew crowds wherever he performed, how he took hymns and popular songs and transformed them into something else entirely, something that made people dance and shout and lose themselves in the music. Charles Buddy Bolden's life, like so many early jazz musicians, ended tragically. Mental illness claimed him in 1907, and he spent the last decades of his life in an institution, never having recorded a single note, and yet his influence rippled outward, shaping the players who came after him, establishing the idea that a jazz musician should have a distinctive personal sound, a voice as recognizable as a speaking voice. Other pioneers were developing their own approaches. Freddie Keppard, another cornetist, known for his powerful tone and creative variations, Joe King Oliver, who would later mentor a young Louis Armstrong, developing a style that used mutes and vocal effects to make his horn weep and laugh and speak, and pianists like Jelly Roll Morton, who claimed, perhaps with some justification, to have invented jazz in 1902, though the truth is that jazz had many parents and no single birth certificate. Jelly Roll Morton, born Ferdinand Joseph Lamothe, was a brilliantly talented and notoriously boastful pianist and composer. His music bridged ragtime and jazz, incorporating Latin rhythms from his Creole heritage, adding blues feeling to sophisticated compositions, and creating arrangements that balanced written structure with space for improvisation. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in those early days, that jazz required both composition and spontaneity, both form and freedom. The racial dynamics of New Orleans shaped the music in complex ways. The city recognized not just black and white, but also Creole, people of mixed African and European ancestry, who often had access to formal musical training and occupied a somewhat distinct social position. When segregation hardened in the early 1900s, Creole musicians found themselves forced into the same spaces as darker-skinned black musicians, and this collision, though born of injustice, proved musically fertile. Creole musicians brought formal training, the ability to read music, familiarity with European classical techniques, while black musicians from uptown brought stronger connections to blues and spirituals, a more improvisational approach, a raw emotional expression, and from this mixture, from the conversation between different traditions and approaches, jazz gained both its sophistication and its soul, its technical proficiency and its emotional immediacy. The music spread through live performance, through musicians traveling and carrying their innovations to other cities, but it remained largely undocumented, unrecorded, existing only in the moment of its performance and in the memories of those who heard it, until 1917, when technology and music intersected in a way that would change everything. The original Dixieland Joss Band, a group of white musicians from New Orleans who had learned by listening to black innovators, recorded what is generally considered the first jazz record. Released in 1917, the spelling would soon change from Joss to jazz, and while these musicians were not the inventors or even the best practitioners of the music, they had access to recording technology and mainstream distribution in ways that black musicians did not. This pattern of white musicians gaining commercial success by playing music developed by black artists would repeat throughout jazz history, a painful reminder of how American racism shaped not just who could play where, but who could profit, who could gain recognition, who would be remembered. And yet the music itself continued to develop, continued to evolve, carrying within it the voices and visions of those who created it, regardless of who received the credit or the royalties. And so the music began to travel, carried north by the Great Migration, that massive movement of black Americans leaving the South in search of opportunity, in search of safety, in search of lives less constrained by Jim Crow's suffocating grip. They brought their music with them, packed alongside their belongings, carrying it in their voices and their memories, and their hopes for what might be possible in cities like Chicago, Kansas City, and New York. Chicago became particularly important in the 1920s, a city of stockyards and steel mills, of speakeasies and nightclubs, where the music could find paying work and eager audiences. The south side of Chicago developed a vibrant jazz scene. Clubs like the Dreamland Cafe and the Sunset Cafe featured the best players, drawing crowds that wanted to dance, to drink, to forget prohibition and economic uncertainty, and simply lose themselves in the music's irresistible pulse. It was to Chicago that a young man named Louis Armstrong came in 1922 Invited by his mentor, King Oliver, to join the Creole Jazz Band as second cornet, Armstrong had grown up in the poorest section of New Orleans, learned to play in a boy's home, and developed a talent so extraordinary that it would transform not just jazz, but the very concept of what a solo instrumentalist could be. Louis Armstrong's innovations cannot be overstated. Before him, jazz was primarily an ensemble music, a collective improvisation where individual voices blended into a polyphonic texture. But Armstrong brought a soloist's conception, playing with such technical virtuosity, such rhythmic sophistication, such emotional depth, that he simply demanded to be heard as an individual voice. He showed that jazz could be a medium for personal expression as powerful as poetry or painting. His tone was warm and expansive, his range extraordinary, but more than technical prowess. Armstrong possessed an ineffable sense of swing, that quality that makes jazz feel like it's floating slightly above the beat, pushing and pulling against the rhythm in ways that create tension and release, anticipation and satisfaction. He seemed to understand instinctively how to make time itself elastic, how to place notes in precisely the unexpected moment that would make the listener's heart lift. The Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings Armstrong made in the mid-1920s stand as monuments of early jazz. Tracks like West End Blues, which opens with an unaccompanied trumpet cadenza of such perfection that musicians still study it a century later, or Potato Head Blues with its stop-time solo that seems to reinvent rhythm itself. These recordings showed the world what jazz could be, how it could balance composition and improvisation, structure and freedom, intellect and emotion. But Armstrong wasn't alone. The 1920s saw an explosion of jazz talent, each musician developing a distinctive voice. Sidney Bechet on soprano saxophone and clarinet, playing with a wide vibrato and passionate intensity that rivaled Armstrong's cornet. Earl Hines on piano, creating a trumpet style of playing where the right hand played strong single-note lines that could cut through the ensemble like a horn, breaking away from the ragtime-influenced stride piano that had dominated before. In Kansas City, a different style was developing, looser and more blues-oriented than the Chicago sound, shaped by the political machine of Tom Pendergast, which kept the city wide open for nightlife even during Prohibition. Musicians could work all night, playing extended sets that encouraged long improvisations, developing ideas across many choruses, finding new paths through familiar chord progressions. The Kansas City style emphasized the blues, those 12-bar structures that had become fundamental to jazz, and it featured a new rhythmic approach. The rhythm section began to move away from the two-beat feel of early jazz, where the bass emphasized the first and third beats of each measure, toward a four-beat feel, where all four beats received equal emphasis, creating a more flowing, more propulsive groove that would eventually become standard in jazz. Count Basie, a pianist from New Jersey who came to Kansas City and fell in love with the music there, developed an approach that favored space and subtlety. His playing was economical, punctuating the music with sparse chords and perfectly timed interjections, trusting his band to create the momentum, and his orchestra, featuring the extraordinary tenor saxophonist Lester Young, would become one of the most influential ensembles in jazz history. Lester Young played in a way that seemed to defy the prevailing fashion, while other tenor players followed the example of Coleman Hawkins, using a big, robust tone and playing harmonically dense solos filled with arpeggios and chord tones. Young played with a lighter, airier sound, emphasizing melody and storytelling, floating phrases that seemed to sing, to speak in complete sentences, and his influence would echo forward through decades, shaping players who came generations later. Meanwhile, in New York, jazz was becoming more sophisticated, more arranged. Duke Ellington, a pianist and composer from Washington, D.C., arrived in the mid-1920s and began building what would become one of the most important orchestras in music history. Ellington understood that jazz could be both popular entertainment and serious art, that it could make people dance and also challenge their ears with complex harmonies and extended forms. The Ellington Orchestra at the Cotton Club, that famous Harlem nightclub where black performers entertained white audiences in a troubling echo of plantation dynamics, nevertheless created music of startling beauty and innovation. Ellington wrote for his specific musicians, crafting parts that showcased their individual sounds and personalities, creating a collective voice that was instantly recognizable, using the orchestra as a painter uses a palette, blending colors and textures to create effects that had never been heard before. Pieces like Mood Indigo, with its unusual instrumentation and haunting melody, or Black and Tan Fantasy, which combined blues feeling with compositional sophistication, showed that jazz could achieve artistic heights while remaining grounded in the dance halls and the lived experience of black Americans. Ellington's music never lost touch with the blues, with the church, with the full spectrum of black musical expression, even as it reached towards something that might be called symphonic. The 1930s brought the swing era, when jazz became America's popular music. Big bands proliferated, their music flooding out of radios and jukeboxes, filling ballrooms and dance halls across the country. The music had grown from small ensembles to orchestras of 15 or more players, arranged with precision but still leaving room for hot solos that could ignite a crowd. Benny Goodman, a white clarinetist from Chicago, became known as the King of Swing, though the title overlooked the many black band leaders like Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Jimmy Lunsford, and Chick Webb, who had been playing swing for years. Goodman's success, including his famous 1938 concert at Carnegie Hall, helped bring jazz to mainstream white audiences, and to his credit, Goodman was among the first white band leaders to integrate his groups, hiring black musicians like Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton despite the resistance he faced. The swing era represented jazz's greatest commercial success, but also a certain tension as the music became more arranged, more polished, more accessible. Some worried it was losing the raw spontaneity, the improvisational daring that had defined its early years. The big bands played written arrangements with soloists given specific choruses to shine, but the overall structure was controlled, organized, designed to appeal to the widest possible audience. Still, within these constraints, extraordinary artistry flourished. Billie Holiday, a singer from Philadelphia who had grown up in hardship, brought to jazz vocals an approach that treated the voice as an instrument. She didn't just sing the melody. She reimagined it, bending time, hanging behind the beat or rushing ahead, choosing to emphasize unexpected words, finding meaning in a lyric that might have seemed straightforward on the page. Her voice was not technically perfect by classical standards, but it was perfect for jazz, intimate, vulnerable, utterly authentic. Holiday's recordings with Lester Young, particularly in the late 1930s, represent a kind of musical telepathy. The two artists seemed to understand each other completely. Young's tenor saxophone wrapping around Holiday's voice like a conversation between old friends, each one responding to the other's phrases, creating a whole greater than the sum of its parts. These recordings remain touchstones, examples of jazz at its most lyrical and emotionally direct. The big band era also saw the rise of the virtuoso soloists who could captivate audiences with technical displays that nevertheless remained grounded in emotional expression. Roy Eldridge on trumpet, extending the vocabulary that Armstrong had established, playing with a fierce intensity and harmonic daring that pointed toward what was coming. Art Tatum on piano, whose technique was so advanced that classical pianists stood in awe, yet who used that technique in service of jazz, reimagining standards with harmonic substitutions and rhythmic complexity that seemed impossible, redefining what was possible on the instrument. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, jazz stood at a crossroads. It had become enormously popular, a true American art form that had conquered the world. European musicians were playing jazz. Asian audiences were hungry for it. The music born in the streets of New Orleans was now global, but some musicians felt constrained by the conventions of swing, hungry for new challenges, new ways of expressing themselves through this music that had always been about innovation, about saying something that had never been said before. In the small clubs of Harlem, after hours when the big band gigs were finished, young musicians were gathering to experiment, to push against the boundaries of what jazz had become. Places like Minton's Playhouse and Monroe's Uptown House became laboratories where players like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, and Kenny Clarke were reimagining the music from the ground up. They called it bebop, or just bop, and it represented a revolution. These musicians took the harmonic structures of swing-era standards, the chord progressions of songs everyone knew, but played them at breakneck tempos with melodies so angular and harmonically complex that dancers stopped trying to follow. This wasn't music for dancing anymore. This was music for listening, for concentrating, for appreciating the sheer artistry and intellectual rigor of what was being created in real time. Charlie Parker, a saxophonist from Kansas City who had woodshedded relentlessly after being humiliated at a jam session as a teenager, emerged as bebop's greatest improviser. His solos were torrents of eighth notes and 16th notes, navigating chord changes with such speed and harmonic sophistication that other musicians struggled to follow. Yet everything he played swung, everything had logic and coherence, musical sentences that built on each other, told stories, even at tempos that seemed to defy human capability. Parker's tone on alto saxophone was bright and cutting, instantly recognizable, and his melodic imagination seemed boundless. He could play a standard like Cherokee and extract from its changes ideas that no one had heard before, transforming familiar material into something utterly new. His recordings from the mid-1940s, pieces like Coco and Ornithology, remain astounding documents of a mind working at the absolute peak of creative possibility. Dizzy Gillespie, a trumpeter from South Carolina with technical command that rivaled anyone who had ever played the instrument, was bebop's other founding genius. His playing featured complex rhythmic accents, harmonic extensions that reached into the upper partials of chords, and a sense of joy and humor that balanced Parker's more troubled intensity. Gillespie was also a skilled composer and arranger, writing pieces like A Night in Tunisia and Salt Peanuts that became bebop standards, expanding the music's repertoire beyond the swing-era songbook. Thelonious Monk, a pianist and composer whose angular melodies and unconventional harmonic choices initially puzzled many listeners, was creating music that seemed to exist in its own universe. His compositions like Round Midnight, Straight No Chaser, and Blue Monk had a logic all their own. Melodies that landed on unexpected notes, rhythms that seemed to pause and stutter in ways that made perfect sense once you adjusted to Monk's vision. He played the piano with a percussive attack, using space and silence as compositional elements, creating music that was both deeply rooted in blues and stride piano tradition and completely original. The bebop revolution was not universally welcomed. Older musicians and critics sometimes dismissed it as musical showing off, as the abandonment of jazz's dance roots and popular appeal. Louis Armstrong, whose own innovations had once been considered radical, famously criticized bebop as confused and pretentious. The music split jazz audiences, creating a divide between those who wanted jazz to remain accessible and entertaining and those who believed it should evolve as a serious art form worthy of concentrated attention. But bebop's influence proved irresistible. Younger musicians absorbed its lessons, learned its language, and by the late 1940s, bebop had become the lingua franca of modern jazz. You couldn't be considered a serious player without mastering its complex harmonic vocabulary and rhythmic sophistication. The music had raised the bar, demanding technical proficiency and theoretical knowledge that previous generations hadn't required. The 1950s brought new developments, new subgenres branching from bebop's tree. Cool jazz emerged on the West Coast, a more relaxed, understated approach championed by players like Miles Davis, whose 1949 Birth of the Cool sessions featured arrangements by Gil Evans that used unusual instrumentation and favored subtlety over aggressive virtuosity. This music breathed, it used space, it suggested rather than declared. Hard bop developed as a response, particularly among East Coast players who felt cool jazz had drained away too much of jazz's blues feeling and emotional intensity. Musicians like Art Blakey, Horace Silver, and Clifford Brown created a music that maintained bebop's harmonic sophistication, but reintegrated gospel and blues influences, creating a sound that was both cerebral and deeply soulful. Music that could make you think and make you feel in equal measure. Miles Davis continued to evolve, becoming one of jazz's most important catalysts for change. His 1959 album, Kind of Blue, pioneered modal jazz, moving away from bebop's rapid chord changes to an approach based on scales or modes, giving improvisers vast harmonic landscapes to explore. The album featured extraordinary players: John Coltrane on tenor saxophone, Bill Evans on piano, Cannonball Adderley on alto saxophone, Paul Chambers on bass, Jimmy Cobb on drums, and the music they created together possessed a timeless quality, spacious and meditative, some of the most beautiful improvisation ever recorded. John Coltrane, who had played with both Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis, emerged as a titanic force in his own right. His early work demonstrated incredible technical facility, playing what critics called sheets of sound, dense cascades of notes that seemed to explore every possible permutation of a chord. But as the 1960s progressed, Coltrane's music became increasingly spiritual, increasingly searching. Albums like A Love Supreme represented jazz as a form of prayer, of transcendence, of reaching toward the divine through sound. The 1960s brought upheaval to jazz as to everything else in American life. The civil rights movement was reshaping the country, raising questions about art and politics, about who got to define culture, about whether black artists should continue working within European-derived forms or forge something entirely new. And jazz, always responsive to the social conditions from which it emerged, reflected these tensions. Free jazz, or avant-garde jazz, pushed against all the remaining conventions. Musicians like Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, and Albert Ayler abandoned standard chord progressions, traditional song forms, sometimes even conventional technique, seeking a music of pure expression, of emotional directness unmediated by harmonic structures that had originated in European classical music. Coleman's 1960 album Free Jazz featured a double quartet improvising collectively for nearly 40 minutes, creating sound that was raw, chaotic, exhilarating, and polarizing. This period saw jazz fragmenting, moving in multiple directions simultaneously. While Coltrane and Coleman were exploring the outer reaches of abstraction, other musicians were incorporating elements of soul and funk, creating what would become jazz fusion. Miles Davis, ever the innovator, released Bitches Brew in 1970, an album that used electric instruments, rock rhythms, and studio effects to create a sound that outraged jazz purists, but opened new possibilities, new audiences. The 1970s and 80s saw jazz move further from the mainstream of popular music, as rock and then disco and then hip-hop captured the youth audience that had once belonged to jazz. The music became more of a niche interest, kept alive by dedicated musicians, by university jazz programs, by a smaller but devoted audience that appreciated its complexity and artistic ambition. Yet jazz continued to evolve, to absorb influences, to reinvent itself. Musicians like Herbie Hancock embraced synthesizers and funk grooves, creating music that was simultaneously commercial and adventurous. Keith Jarrett explored solo piano improvisation, creating extended spontaneous compositions that drew on jazz, classical music, and folk traditions. Pat Metheny brought a lyrical sensibility to jazz guitar, incorporating influences from Brazilian music and progressive rock. The 1980s saw a turn toward tradition. Young musicians like Wynton Marsalis championed a return to acoustic jazz, to the bebop and hard bop traditions, arguing that jazz had lost its way in the fusion era. This neo-traditional movement brought renewed attention to jazz's history, to its roots, but also sparked debates about whether jazz should primarily preserve its past or continue evolving, whether reverence for tradition might become a prison rather than a foundation. The decades that followed saw jazz become a global language, musicians from every continent interpreting and transforming the tradition. Scandinavian players brought their folk melodies and harmonic sensibilities. Japanese musicians combined jazz with traditional instruments and aesthetics. Cuban and Brazilian artists had long since created their own jazz dialects, demonstrating that this music born in New Orleans had become something larger, a worldwide conversation, a set of principles and practices that could accommodate infinite variation. And through all these changes, through bebop and cool and hard bop and modal and free and fusion and neo-traditional, through every revolution and counter-revolution, certain essential elements persisted: the centrality of improvisation, the conversation between musicians, the blues feeling that could surface even in the most abstract explorations, the swing, that quality of rhythm that makes the music feel alive, breathing, human. Jazz in the 21st century exists in a different cultural landscape than the music that emerged in New Orleans over a century ago. It's no longer America's popular music, no longer the soundtrack to Saturday night dances, but it endures, taught in conservatories, performed in concert halls and festivals, still evolving as contemporary artists like Kamasi Washington, Esperanza Spalding, and Robert Glasper draw on hip-hop, electronic music, and global influences, creating music that honors the tradition while refusing to be bound by it. The music contains multitudes now, a history so rich and varied that no single narrative can encompass it. But perhaps that's fitting for an art form that has always been about individual voices coming together, about finding unity in diversity, about the miracle that occurs when musicians listen deeply to each other and create something that has never existed before and will never exist again in quite the same way. And so we arrive at a question that has no single answer. What is it about this music, this art form born from suffering and joy intertwined, that has endured for more than a century, that has spread across every continent, that continues to speak to something essential in the human experience? Perhaps it begins with the act of improvisation itself, that leap into the unknown that every jazz musician takes when they step forward to solo. There's something profoundly human about creating in real time, about making decisions in the moment with no safety net, no ability to erase and revise, just the courage to play the next note and trust that it will lead somewhere meaningful. In this way, jazz mirrors life itself. We don't get to rehearse our days, to try different versions and choose the best one. We simply move forward, responding to what comes, making choices based on intuition and experience and hope. And sometimes we surprise ourselves. Sometimes we find beauty we didn't know we were capable of creating. Sometimes we stumble, but we keep going. We keep playing. The conversation at the heart of jazz, the way musicians listen and respond to each other, offers a model for how humans might interact more broadly. There's a generosity required, a willingness to support another's moment in the spotlight, to provide the right harmonic or rhythmic foundation for their expression. And there's also the knowledge that your turn will come, that you too will be heard, will be supported in your own voice. This balance between individual and collective, between assertion and accommodation, between standing out and fitting in, jazz negotiates this territory with a grace that feels instructive. The best jazz groups achieve something like democracy in action. Each voice matters. Each contribution shapes the whole. And yet the music doesn't descend into chaos. Instead, it achieves a kind of organic order, a structure that emerges from collaboration rather than being imposed from above. The blues, that foundation upon which so much jazz is built, carries within it a profound wisdom about the human condition. the acknowledgement that life contains suffering, disappointment, heartbreak, but the refusal to be defeated by these realities, instead transforming them into something beautiful, something that can be shared, something that connects us in our common struggles and our common humanity. When Billie Holiday sings of strange fruit hanging from southern trees, she transmutes unspeakable horror into art, bearing witness, refusing to let these crimes be forgotten. And when Louis Armstrong plays West End blues, he takes the sorrow implicit in the blues form and elevates it to something transcendent, something that acknowledges pain but also insists on joy, on the persistence of beauty even in a broken world. Jazz has always been about transformation, taking the materials at hand, often limited materials, sometimes instruments that were cast-offs or second-hand, and creating something precious, something that could not have been created with better resources. This is a kind of alchemy, the transformation of limitation into creativity, of constraint into innovation. The music's relationship to time feels particularly profound. The way jazz musicians inhabit rhythm, stretching and compressing it, playing behind the beat or ahead of it, creating tension and release through their placement of notes in time. This is time made elastic, made human, freed from the mechanical tick of the metronome to become something more fluid, more responsive to feeling and intention. And there's the swing itself, that quality that defies easy definition. You can't notate swing precisely, can't reduce it to a formula. Musicians speak of it in mystical terms. You either have it or you don't. It's a feeling, a way of moving through time that makes the music breathe, that gives it life. And perhaps this ineffable quality is part of jazz's power, the reminder that not everything can be quantified or explained, that some truths can only be felt. The history of jazz runs parallel to the history of black struggle and triumph in America, from its origins in slavery and its aftermath, through Jim Crow and the Great Migration, through the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. The music has been both a refuge and a weapon, a way to maintain dignity in the face of degradation, a way to assert humanity when it was being denied, and a way to achieve excellence so undeniable that even hostile audiences had to acknowledge it. Duke Ellington's insistence that his music was beyond category, that it couldn't be reduced to simple definitions or classifications, was itself a political statement, a refusal to be limited by others' expectations, by the categories and boxes that American racism tried to impose. His music was sophisticated, complex, beautiful, and unapologetically black, demonstrating that these qualities were not contradictory but complementary. The global reach of jazz, the way it has been adopted and adapted by musicians from Tokyo to Stockholm to Johannesburg, speaks to something universal in its language, despite emerging from a very specific cultural context, from the particular experience of African Americans. The music contains within it principles and practices that translate across cultures. The emphasis on individual expression within collective creation, the value placed on innovation and originality, the celebration of technical mastery in service of emotional truth. And yet, for all its global influence, jazz remains deeply connected to its roots, to the blues and spirituals, to the work songs and ring shouts, to the African rhythmic complexity and the call and response patterns. These connections persist even in the most abstract contemporary jazz, like deep roots that nourish the tree no matter how far its branches extend. The lineage matters in jazz, the way knowledge passes from one generation to the next, not just through formal education, though that has become important, but through the older tradition of mentorship, of young musicians learning by listening, by sitting in, by absorbing the wisdom of elders who have walked the path before them. This creates a living tradition, a chain of influence stretching back to those early days in New Orleans and forward into an unknown future. There's something moving about the fact that musicians today can still listen to recordings of Charlie Parker or Billie Holiday or Louis Armstrong, can study their phrasing and their choices, can learn from artists who have been gone for decades. The recordings become a kind of immortality, a way for the music to persist beyond the fleeting moments of its creation. And yet recordings can never fully capture the live experience, the energy in the room, the unique interaction between musicians and audience in a specific moment that will never return. Perhaps that's appropriate for a music so fundamentally about presence, about being fully engaged in the current moment, about the impossibility of stepping in the same river twice. Every performance is different. Every solo takes a new path. And this impermanence, this acceptance that beauty can exist briefly and then dissolve, feels like a kind of wisdom, a recognition that everything changes, everything passes. And that's not a tragedy, but simply the nature of existence. As the night deepens, as this long journey through jazz history winds toward its end, I find myself thinking about all the musicians who created this art form, those who became famous and those whose names are lost to history, the ones who recorded prolifically and the ones who played only in local clubs, never documented, never celebrated beyond their immediate community. Each one contributed something, each voice added to the great conversation, and the music we have today, in all its diversity and complexity, is built on their collective effort, their dedication to an art form that rarely made them rich, that often subjected them to indignity and discrimination, but that gave them a way to speak truth, to create beauty, to connect with others across the barriers that society erected. The music continues. New musicians discovering jazz every day, bringing their own experiences and influences, their own questions and concerns, finding in this tradition room for their voices, their stories, proof that jazz remains vital, remains relevant, remains capable of expressing the full range of human feeling and thought in the small clubs and concert halls, in basement jam sessions and university practice rooms, in bedroom studios where young producers sample old records, creating new contexts for familiar sounds. The conversation continues, the tradition evolves, the music breathes and changes and persists. There's a recording of John Coltrane near the end of his life, Kihigi, playing with an intensity that seems to transcend the physical, reaching for something beyond language, beyond conventional musical expression. And you can hear in those sounds a longing, a searching, a refusal to settle for easy answers or comfortable formulas, a commitment to pushing further, digging deeper, seeking truth through sound. That spirit, that restless creative energy, that insistence on honesty and innovation runs through jazz history like a golden thread, connecting Buddy Bolden to Charlie Parker, to John Coltrane, to the musicians playing tonight in cities around the world, each generation receiving the tradition and transforming it, honoring the past by refusing to merely repeat it, And perhaps that's the deepest lesson jazz offers, that tradition and innovation need not be opposites, that you can respect what came before while insisting on your right to say something new, that the most profound way to honor your ancestors is not to imitate them, but to embody their spirit of courage and creativity in your own unique voice. The music asks difficult things of us. It asks us to listen deeply, to embrace complexity, to find beauty in unexpected places, to accept that perfection might matter less than authenticity, that the supposedly wrong note played with conviction and feeling might be more truthful than the technically correct one played without soul. As this story fades, as the final notes drift into silence, the music itself continues somewhere, always, in recordings and in live performances, in the minds of musicians practicing their craft, in the hearts of listeners who have found in jazz a companion, a comfort, a challenge, a mirror reflecting their own complexity back to them. The river keeps flowing, carrying new currents, new tributaries joining the mainstream, but always recognizing itself, always jazz, always that conversation between musicians, that transformation of limitation into art, that insistence on swing and soul and the blues, that celebration of individual voices creating collective beauty. And in the quiet that follows, in the space after the last note has faded, something lingers, a feeling, a memory, the echo of all those voices, all those instruments, all those nights when music transformed a room, transformed the people in it, created a moment of transcendence that existed briefly and then dissolved, leaving only the memory and the certainty that somewhere, tonight, it's happening again, the miracle of jazz, being born anew. The story rests here, in this stillness, in this silence that contains all the music that has been and all the music yet to come, waiting, patient, eternal as the night itself. I can see the mist rising from the rails this evening, the kind of pale fog that gathers low to the ground when iron has cooled after a long day, and somewhere in that mist there is the faint echo of something that changed the world, not all at once, but gradually, persistently, the way water wears stone into new shapes. There was a time when distance was measured differently, when a journey from one town to another might take days on horseback, weeks by carriage, and the thought of moving heavy goods across a vast landscape seemed almost beyond imagining. Coal sat deep in mines, or rested in the earth, and the energy required to move these things, well, it moved at the pace of horses, of human muscle, of wind filling sails on canals, but there were people who dreamed in different rhythms, who watched steam rise from kettles and saw not just vapor, but possibility, potential, power waiting to be harnessed, and in workshops scattered across England in the late 1700s and early 1800s, a quiet revolution was taking shape, one that would not announce itself with proclamations or manifestos, but with the hiss of steam, the turn of wheels, the gradual acceleration of progress itself. The night feels particularly still when I think about those early years, when the idea of a self-moving engine seemed almost magical, almost impossible. Inventors and engineers working by candlelight, sketching designs, calculating pressures, imagining what might happen if steam, that invisible force, could be contained, directed, transformed into motion. Picture the English countryside in those days, green hills rolling toward horizons, stone walls dividing fields, and cutting through this landscape. Narrow tracks of iron rails, originally laid for horse-drawn wagons carrying coal from mines to rivers. Simple things, these early railways, just wooden rails sometimes topped with iron plates, and horses pulling loads that would have been impossible to move otherwise. One horse could pull on rails what might take 10 horses to drag over rough roads, and yet, even in this simple system, there was a recognition, a dawning awareness that if somehow, some way, the horse could be replaced with something more powerful, something tireless, something that burned coal to create its own strength, then distance itself might collapse, might become something different, something smaller. I find myself imagining the sounds of those transitional years, the clip of hooves on hard ground, the creak of wooden wheels on iron rails, the voices of men calling out as loads were secured, and beneath it all, in workshops and engine houses, the newer sounds beginning to emerge, the clank of metal being shaped, the roar of fire in experimental boilers, the cautious, careful, almost tentative hiss of steam being released under controlled pressure. Because steam itself was not new, humans had observed its power for centuries, had seen it lift kettle lids, had wondered at its force, but to capture it, to build a vessel strong enough to contain its pressure without exploding, to channel that pressure into rotary motion, into the turning of wheels. This required a particular kind of thinking, a blend of theoretical understanding and practical craft, of mathematical precision and intuitive feel for materials and forces. The stars are visible tonight, scattered across a clear winter sky. And I wonder if those early engineers looked up at the same constellations, pondering the problems they faced, the challenge of creating something that had never quite existed before. Not just an improvement on existing technology, but a fundamental reimagining of how power could be generated, controlled, and applied to the movement of heavy loads across landscape. There were failures. Of course there were failures. Boilers that couldn't maintain pressure, cylinders that wore down too quickly, designs that looked elegant on paper but proved impractical in iron and steam. And yet each failure taught something, revealed some principle, some relationship between heat and pressure, between the diameter of a cylinder and the force it could generate, between the weight of an engine and the adhesion of iron wheels on iron rails. And in this slow accumulation of knowledge, this patient building of understanding through trial and observation and modification, something was emerging, something that would eventually carry goods and people across continents, that would shrink the perceived size of nations, that would make the remote accessible, the distant near, that would create new patterns of commerce and migration, new ways of thinking about time and space and possibility. But tonight, in this quiet moment, I'm interested in the beginning, in those uncertain years when the locomotive was more dream than reality, more ambition than achievement, when a handful of engineers truly believed, that they could build a machine that would move itself, that would breathe fire and exhale steam and roll forward on rails with a power derived not from muscle, but from the transformation of heat into motion, from the ancient energy stored in coal, released suddenly, dramatically, into the present moment. The air feels cool, gentle, and in my mind I can almost see the glow of forge fires in those early workshops, can almost hear the sound of hammers shaping metal, can almost sense the mixture of excitement and uncertainty, the knowledge that something significant was being born, even if its full implications couldn't yet be understood. The story begins, as so many stories of transformation do, with someone noticing what others had overlooked, with the recognition that a tool designed for one purpose might be adapted, reimagined, transformed into something far more significant. In the coal mines of England, particularly in the north, there had long been a problem, a challenge that grew more pressing as mines dug deeper into the earth. Water seeped into these underground chambers, pooled in the lowest shafts, and without some means of removing it, the mines would flood, rendering the coal inaccessible, the workers unable to descend, the entire enterprise threatened by the simple, persistent, patient accumulation of groundwater. And so engines were developed, stationary engines that used steam pressure to drive pumps, great beams that rocked back and forth, drawing water up from the depths. These were the atmospheric engines, improved over decades, refined by engineers like Thomas Newcomen in the early 1700s. Massive structures of beam and cylinder, of valves and condensers that stood beside mine shafts and labored day and night, breathing steam, exhausting vapor, keeping the water at bay. But these engines were fixed in place, anchored to the ground, built into permanent structures. They could pump, but they could not move, and therein lay both their utility and their limitation. It was a Cornish engineer named Richard Trevithick who began to see things differently, who looked at these stationary engines and wondered, what if the engine itself could move? What if instead of being a building, it could be a vehicle? What if steam pressure, properly harnessed, could propel not just a pump rod, but an entire machine along a track? Trevithick was working in the late 1700s in a landscape dominated by tin and copper mines, where steam engines pumped water and hauled ore, and he possessed that particular combination of theoretical knowledge and hands-on experience, the ability to understand pressure and temperature, to calculate forces and design mechanisms, but also to work with metal, to see how components might fit together, to imagine solutions that existed nowhere except in his own mind. The key insight, the crucial development that made everything else possible, was the high-pressure steam engine. Earlier engines had operated at pressures barely above atmospheric, using the vacuum created by condensing steam to generate force. But Trevithick realized that if he could build a boiler strong enough to contain steam at much higher pressures, and if he could design cylinders and pistons to harness that pressure directly, he could create an engine far more powerful relative to its size, compact enough, light enough to mount on wheels. This was not without risk. High-pressure steam meant high-pressure danger. Boilers could explode, had exploded, sending metal shards and scalding vapor through workshops, killing operators, destroying buildings. The fear of such catastrophes was real, well-founded, and yet Trevithick believed the benefits outweighed the dangers, believed that with proper design, proper materials, proper understanding of the forces involved, a high-pressure engine could be made safely, reliably. On Christmas Eve in 1801, in the town of Camborne in Cornwall, Trevithick demonstrated something the world had never quite seen before: a steam-powered road carriage, a machine that carried passengers up a hill called Beacon Hill, moving under its own power, breathing steam and smoke, a mechanical thing that moved like a living creature, though built of iron and fire. The demonstration was brief. The machine suffered a mechanical failure days later and was damaged in a fire, but the principle had been proven. Steam could propel. Engines could move themselves. The age of the horse, while far from over, had encountered its eventual successor. But roads were rough, uneven, and the weight of a steam engine, even a compact high-pressure design, was substantial. Wheels sank into mud, got caught on stones. The efficiency was poor, the practical applications limited, and so attention turned to those iron rails, those smooth parallel tracks, already being used in mines and quarries, where a horse could pull remarkable loads because the friction was so much less than on ordinary roads. What if, Trevithick wondered, what if a steam engine ran on rails instead of roads? What if those smooth iron surfaces that made horse-drawn wagons so efficient could also benefit a mechanical engine, allowing it to pull even heavier loads, to move with even greater efficiency? In 1804, at the Penydarren Iron Works in Wales, Trevithick built a locomotive, an actual railway locomotive designed to run on existing tramway rails. It was an ungainly thing by later standards, a cylindrical boiler lying horizontal, a single cylinder driving the wheels through gears, a tall chimney rising from one end. The whole apparatus mounted on a wheeled frame. The purpose was simple: to settle a wager. The ironworks owner had bet 500 guineas, a substantial sum, that Trevithick's engine could haul 10 tons of iron along the tramway from Penydarren to Abercynon, a distance of nearly 10 miles. Skeptics abounded. Many believed the smooth iron wheels would simply slip on smooth iron rails, that there wouldn't be enough grip, enough adhesion to pull such a load. But on February 21st, 1804, the locomotive moved, slowly, cautiously, pulling its load of iron, plus 70 men who had climbed aboard to witness this moment. It traveled the full distance, taking just over 4 hours, averaging nearly 5 miles per hour, proving beyond doubt that iron wheels on iron rails could indeed generate sufficient friction, that steam power could be applied to railway transport, that a new era was technically feasible. And yet, and this is the curious thing about innovation, proving something is possible and making it practical are two very different achievements. Trevithick's locomotive was too heavy for the rails it ran on. The cast iron rails broke under its weight. The tramway owners were not pleased, and though the technical success was undeniable, the commercial application remained elusive. Trevithick built other locomotives, demonstrated them in London, created a circular track near Euston Square where the public could pay to ride behind a steam engine, calling the exhibition "Catch Me Who Can." But public enthusiasm didn't translate into industrial adoption. The technology was proven, but not yet refined, not yet matched to the right application, the right infrastructure, the right economic conditions. For a time, the locomotive remained a curiosity, a mechanical wonder that existed on the margins of practical transportation. Colliery owners continued to use horses. Canal operators continued to rely on barges. The existing systems worked well enough, and the investment required to build railways specifically designed for steam locomotives, railways with stronger rails, better gradients, purpose-built infrastructure, seemed daunting, uncertain, risky. But in the coal fields of northeastern England, particularly around Newcastle and the surrounding regions, the problem of coal transport was becoming acute. The mines were producing enormous quantities. The demand in London and other cities was growing, and the existing methods, horses on wooden wagonways, boats on rivers and canals, were reaching their limits. Capacity constraints were real. Costs were high, and there was a growing recognition that whoever could solve the transport problem, whoever could move coal more efficiently from mine to market, would gain tremendous advantage. It was in this environment, this landscape of economic pressure and technical possibility, that a new generation of engineers began working with locomotives, not as curiosities, not as demonstrations of principle, but as practical tools, as machines that needed to be reliable, efficient, economically viable. Among these engineers was a man named William Hedley, who in 1813 designed a locomotive called Puffing Billy for the Wylam Colliery. It was a more refined machine than Trevithick's earlier attempts, with better weight distribution, improved mechanical reliability, and it worked, truly worked, hauling coal wagons day after day, proving that a locomotive could be not just a technical success, but an operational asset. And there was Timothy Hackworth, who would later become instrumental in locomotive development, working at the time on stationary engines, but watching, learning, understanding the principles that made steam locomotion possible. But the figure who would come to dominate this era, who would take the scattered innovations and experimental machines and transform them into a coherent, practical, revolutionary system, was a man named George Stephenson, born in 1781 in Wylam, Northumberland, into a world where coal and steam were already reshaping the landscape, where the marriage of the two would soon reshape the world. Stevenson's background was not one of formal education. He couldn't read until he was 18, learned through observation and practice, worked his way up from fireman to engine wright, maintaining and repairing the stationary engines that powered the coal mines. And in this hands-on environment, surrounded by steam and machinery, he developed an intuitive understanding of how these systems worked, what made them efficient or inefficient, reliable or prone to failure. In 1814, the same year, Puffing Billy was proving itself at Wylam. Stephenson built his first locomotive, named Blücher after the Prussian general. For the Killingworth Colliery, where he worked, it wasn't radically different from other locomotives of the period, but it worked reliably, and Stephenson, unlike many inventors before him, didn't just build a machine and move on. He stayed with it, refined it, solved the problems that emerged during actual operation, learned from every failure, incorporated every improvement. Over the next several years, Stephenson built more locomotives, each one incorporating lessons from the previous designs, improving the valve gear, the coupling rods, the arrangement of the wheels, and crucially, he began to think not just about the locomotive itself, but about the entire system, the rails, the gradients, the curves, the infrastructure that would allow locomotives to operate at their full potential. Because a locomotive is only as good as the railway it runs on, and the existing tramways, designed for horse-drawn wagons, with their sharp curves and uneven grades and relatively light rails, were not ideal for steam traction. What was needed, Stephenson increasingly understood, was a purpose-built railway, engineered from the beginning for locomotives, with proper foundations, strong rails, gentle curves and gradients that would allow these machines to move efficiently, economically, transforming the very landscape to accommodate a new form of movement. The opportunity came in 1821 when a group of businessmen and coal owners proposed building a railway, not just another colliery tramway, but an actual public railway, to connect the coal fields around Darlington with the port of Stockton, a distance of about 25 miles, to be called the Stockton and Darlington Railway. The question was, should this railway use horses, as was traditional, or should it use locomotives, as some of the more forward-thinking promoters suggested? And if locomotives, who should design them? Who understood both the machines and the railways well enough to make the entire system work? The answer, increasingly, seemed to be George Stephenson. Stephenson was appointed engineer to the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1821, and with this appointment, the nature of railway building began to change, to evolve from simple tramways into something more ambitious, more carefully engineered, more systematic in its approach to the challenges of moving heavy loads across distance. The work required was immense, surveying the route, determining the optimal path between collieries and coast, calculating gradients that would allow loaded wagons to descend by gravity, while empty wagons could be pulled back up by horses or stationary engines, or increasingly in Stephenson's vision, by locomotives capable of hauling trains in both directions. And so the landscape was measured, marked, transformed. Cuttings were dug through hills, embankments were raised across valleys, and when the river Skern presented an obstacle, Stephenson designed a bridge, not of wood, but of stone, an elegant arched structure that still stands today, a monument to the permanence with which this new infrastructure was being built. Recognition that this was not temporary, not experimental, but the foundation of something enduring. The rails themselves represented a crucial decision. Earlier, tramways had used cast iron, brittle, prone to breaking under heavy loads, but wrought iron was becoming available, stronger, more flexible, better able to withstand the repeated passage of weighted wheels, and Stephenson specified rails of wrought iron, fish-bellied in cross-section, deeper in the middle to provide strength where it was most needed, supported on stone blocks rather than wooden sleepers, every detail considered, every choice made with an eye toward durability and performance. And then there were the locomotives. Stephenson established works at Newcastle, employing skilled craftsmen, building engines to his own designs, and for the Stockton and Darlington, he constructed locomotion number 1, a machine that embodied years of accumulated knowledge. Improvements tested on the colliery railways, refinements that made it more reliable than its predecessors, more powerful, more suited to the work it would be asked to perform. On September 27th, 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened, and locomotion number 1, with Stephenson's brother James at the controls, pulled a train of wagons loaded with coal and flour, plus a passenger coach called Experiment that carried directors and dignitaries along the route from Darlington towards Stockton. Crowds gathered to watch, tens of thousands of people lining the track, witnessing something unprecedented. A machine pulling a train at speeds reaching 15 miles per hour, faster than any horse could maintain with such a load. The opening day was ceremony, spectacle, demonstration. But what mattered more was what came after, the daily operation, the routine hauling of coal from pit to port. And here the railway proved its worth, not in dramatic fashion, but through the steady accumulation of tons moved, costs reduced, efficiency gained. Horses were still used for some services, particularly the passenger coaches that ran on regular schedules, but increasingly, locomotives handled the heavy freight, the coal that was the railway's reason for existence. And yet, even as the Stockton and Darlington demonstrated that railways could work, that they could operate profitably, that steam locomotion was practical for freight, there remained skepticism about passenger service, about whether people would want to ride behind these noisy, smoky, somewhat unpredictable machines, whether the speed would be tolerable, whether the public would embrace this new form of travel. The answer would come with the next great railway project, and it would transform not just transportation, but the entire conception of what railways could be, what they could mean, how they could reshape the geography of commerce and daily life. Liverpool and Manchester, two cities barely 30 miles apart, yet separated by difficult terrain, by the lack of good roads, by a canal monopoly that charged high rates and suffered from frequent delays. Liverpool was a great port, gateway to Atlantic trade, while Manchester was becoming the world's first industrial city, its cotton mills driving the British economy, and the movement of raw cotton from port to mills, of finished goods from mills to port, was a constant bottleneck, a limitation on growth, a problem crying out for solution. Various proposals had been made, canal improvements, new roads, but a group of merchants and industrialists, frustrated by the existing system, began to consider something more radical, a railway, not just for coal like the Stockton and Darlington, but for general freight and passengers, a railway that would compete directly with the canals, that would offer faster, more reliable, more economical service. The challenge was significant. The terrain between Liverpool and Manchester included chat moss, a vast peat bog that many believed impossible to cross with any kind of permanent way. There were hills requiring deep cuttings, valleys requiring high embankments, and there was fierce opposition from canal owners, from turnpike trusts, from landowners who didn't want locomotives crossing their estates, from those who feared the railways or who benefited from the existing transport system. But George Stephenson, appointed chief engineer in 1826, believed it could be done, and he set about proving it, surveying routes, planning the engineering works, and when Parliament held hearings on whether to authorize the railway, Stephenson testified, though his thick Northumbrian accent and lack of formal education made him vulnerable to withering cross-examination by canal company lawyers who sought to paint him as unqualified. The bill was initially rejected, but the railway promoters persisted, hired additional engineers to refine the survey, addressed the concerns raised in Parliament, and in 1826 a new bill passed, authorization was granted, and construction began on what would become the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the world's first intercity passenger railway, the prototype for everything that would follow. The engineering works were extraordinary. At Olive Mount, a cutting was excavated through 2 miles of rock, in some places 60 feet deep, requiring the removal of thousands of tons of stone, all done by hand, by laborers with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, with occasional help from gunpowder charges that would loosen the rock, the noise, the dust, the sheer physical effort involved, almost beyond modern comprehension. At Sankey Brook, a viaduct was required, 9 arches spanning the valley, 50 feet high, built of brick, some 20 million bricks in total, each one laid by hand, the structure massive, permanent, designed to carry not just the railways of that moment, but the heavier trains and higher speeds that might come in future years. And Chatmoss, the peat bog that skeptics insisted would swallow any railway attempted across it. Stevenson conquered through persistence and ingenuity, floating the railway on a bed of heather and branches, layering material until a stable foundation emerged, draining water, gradually building up the embankment until rails could be laid across ground that had seemed impassable, proving that engineering could overcome nature's obstacles, that careful study and determined effort could solve problems that appeared insoluble. But perhaps the most significant decision, the choice that would define not just this railway but the future of rail transport, concerned motive power. Should the Liverpool and Manchester use stationary engines with cables that would haul trains between fixed points, or should it use locomotives, mobile engines that would travel with the trains they pulled? The debate was real. Stationary engines were proven, reliable. Their power output was predictable, whereas locomotives were still relatively new, somewhat experimental, their long-term reliability uncertain. Many of the railway's directors favored the stationary engine approach, the conservative choice, the safe choice, but Stevenson advocated for locomotives, believing they offered greater flexibility, easier operation, better economics, and to settle the question, to demonstrate what locomotives could achieve. The railway directors organized a competition, the Rainhill Trials, held in October of 1829, where locomotive builders would compete to show whose engine was fastest, most reliable, most economical, capable of meeting the demanding specifications set forth by the railway company. The trials were held on a level stretch of completed track near Rainhill, and they became a public spectacle. Thousands of people gathering to watch these mechanical marvels compete, to see which would prove superior, which would earn the right to power the new railway. Several engines were entered, some serious contenders, others more fanciful. There was Cycloped, essentially a horse on a treadmill, quickly disqualified. There was Perseverance, damaged in transit and unable to complete the trials. And there were 3 serious competitors: Sans Pareil, built by Timothy Hackworth; Novelty, built by John Braithwaite and John Erickson; and Rocket, built by George Stephenson and his son Robert, who had been studying engineering formally, bringing theoretical knowledge to complement his father's practical experience. Sans Pareil was powerful, traditional in design, similar to earlier Stephenson locomotives. It performed well initially, but suffered mechanical failures. A cracked cylinder that ended its participation. It was capable, but not quite reliable enough, not quite refined enough for the demands being placed upon it. Novelty was radical, lightweight, with a vertical boiler and sophisticated mechanical arrangements. It achieved impressive speeds, delighting the crowds, but it too suffered from reliability issues, leaking joints, mechanical problems, the price of innovation sometimes being fragility, complexity that created points of failure. And then there was Rocket, and Rocket was different. not because it introduced any single revolutionary feature, but because it combined several important innovations into a coherent, reliable, effective design. It had a multi-tube boiler with 25 copper tubes running through the water, dramatically increasing the heating surface, allowing more efficient generation of steam. It had a blast pipe, directing exhaust steam up the chimney, creating a draft that drew air through the firebox, intensifying combustion. These features working together, each enhancing the other, creating a machine significantly more powerful and efficient than its predecessors. Over several days, Rocket performed, hauling weighted trains back and forth along the trial section, maintaining required speeds, proving reliable, economical, superior. The Stephensons had not just built a locomotive, they had built the template, the archetype, the fundamental design that would inform locomotive construction for decades to come. Rocket won the trials, earned the prize money of £500, but more importantly, won the argument, proved that locomotives were ready, that they could provide the power, the reliability, the economy that a major railway required. The decision was made. The Liverpool and Manchester would be a locomotive railway, and George Stephenson would build the engines. The railway opened on September 15th, 1830, with grand ceremony, the Duke of Wellington attending, 8 trains carrying dignitaries, crowds lining the route, and tragedy too, for William Huskisson, a member of Parliament, was struck by rocket during the opening ceremonies, becoming the first person killed by a railway locomotive. A sobering reminder that this new technology carried risks as well as benefits, that speed and power demanded respect, caution, new ways of thinking about safety and operation. But despite this tragedy, the railway was an immediate success. Passenger numbers exceeded all projections. Within weeks, the trains were carrying hundreds of people daily between the two cities, traveling in an hour and a half what had previously taken 4 or 5 hours by coach. The fare was affordable, the service regular, and people embraced it, not with fear or reluctance, but with enthusiasm, with excitement at this new experience, this new velocity of life, and the implications rippled outward. Other cities looked at Liverpool and Manchester and saw possibility, saw opportunity. Railway schemes were proposed across Britain. Investors eager to fund construction, engineers eager to build, a railway mania beginning to take hold. The recognition that this technology was not just viable, but transformative, that it would remake the landscape, the economy, the very experience of distance and time. The 1830s saw railway construction accelerate across Britain, lines radiating outward from London, connecting cities that had never known such intimate contact. Birmingham, Bristol, Southampton, each new railway requiring its own Acts of Parliament, its own surveys and negotiations, its own monumental engineering works. And at the center of much of this expansion was George Stephenson and his son Robert, consulting on routes, designing locomotives, establishing the standards that would define railway practice. One of the most significant decisions, one that seems almost mundane yet had profound consequences, was the choice of gauge, the distance between the rails. Early railways had used various gauges, whatever seemed appropriate for local conditions. But as networks began to connect, the need for standardization became apparent. Trains needed to run from one railway onto another, through carriages needed to traverse multiple companies' lines, and inconsistent gauge would make this impossible. Stevenson favored 4 feet 8.5 inches, the gauge he had used on the Stockton and Darlington and Liverpool and Manchester, a measurement derived from the old wagon ways of Northumberland, where wheel spacing had been determined by the width of carts, which in turn may have descended from Roman chariot widths, ancient patterns perpetuating into the industrial age. And as Stevenson's influence spread, as railways across Britain adopted his gauge, it became the standard, eventually termed standard gauge, the width that most of the world's railways would follow, though not all. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, engineer of this Great Western Railway connecting London to Bristol, believed a broader gauge would allow for greater stability, higher speeds, more comfortable travel, and he built his railway to 7 feet and a quarter-inch gauge, creating a magnificent engineering works, the Box Tunnel, nearly 2 miles long through the Cotswold Hills, and locomotives designed specifically for this broader track, achieving speeds and smoothness that Brunel believed vindicated his choice. But the incompatibility created problems. Passengers and freight traveling between standard gauge and broad gauge railways had to change trains. Goods had to be unloaded and reloaded, and as the standard gauge network grew larger, more extensive, the broad gauge became increasingly isolated. Eventually, the Great Western would be forced to convert, to abandon Brunel's vision in favor of compatibility, standardization proving more valuable than theoretical superiority. The locomotives themselves evolved rapidly during these years. Robert Stephenson, taking increasing control of the locomotive works as his father focused on railway surveying and promotion, designed engines that were more sophisticated, more powerful, more refined than Rocket had been, the Planet class, the Patentee class, incorporating improvements in valve gear, in boiler design, in the arrangement of cylinders and wheels, each generation of locomotives learning from the previous, incorporating the lessons of operation, the knowledge gained from thousands of miles of running, and other engineers contributed their innovations. Timothy Hackworth continuing to develop locomotives in the Northeast, experimenting with different cylinder arrangements, different approaches to generating and using steam, and across the Atlantic, in America, engineers adapted British designs to local conditions, to lighter rails and tighter curves, to the vast distances and different economic constraints of a newer, less densely settled land. The 1840s saw railway construction reach a fever pitch, particularly in Britain, where what became known as railway mania gripped investors and promoters alike. Schemes were proposed to connect virtually every town of consequence, some sensible and well-planned, others wildly optimistic or outright fraudulent, and vast sums of money were invested, fortunes made and lost, as the railway network expanded from hundreds of miles to thousands. The social impact was becoming apparent. Farmers could send fresh milk to distant cities, arriving before it spoiled. Fish caught in the morning could be in London by evening. Newspapers printed in the capital could reach provincial towns the same day. Information, goods, people, all flowing faster than ever before. The friction of distance reduced, though never eliminated. The locomotive shrinking Britain, making it more unified, more interconnected, more aware of itself as a single space rather than a collection of isolated localities. and the experience of railway travel itself was becoming normalized, no longer a novelty, but a routine part of life for millions. The railway timetable becoming a fixture of daily planning, the station becoming a new kind of public space, the waiting room, the platform, the booking office, entirely new architectures emerging to serve this new form of movement, great sheds of iron and glass, like St. Pancras and Paddington, cathedrals dedicated not to worship, but to departure and arrival, to the continual flow of humanity through space. The locomotives of mid-century were larger than their predecessors, more powerful, capable of hauling longer trains at higher speeds. Engineers had learned to build bigger boilers, to use steam more efficiently, to design wheel arrangements that distributed weight while providing traction. The classic configuration emerging, with a leading truck of small wheels for guidance, large driving wheels for speed and power, and trailing wheels to support the firebox, each element serving its purpose, the whole machine a study in functional elegance. But even as railways reached their zenith in Britain, becoming the dominant form of land transport, the most visible symbol of industrial progress, they were spreading globally to Europe, where France and Germany and Italy built networks connecting their territories, to India, where British engineers laid tracks across vast distances, serving colonial administration and commerce, to the Americas, where railways would play a crucial role in westward expansion, in the binding together of a continent. In the United States, the railway took on particular significance, a tool of nation building, of manifest destiny. The first transcontinental railway, completed in 1869 when the Union Pacific and Central Pacific met at Promontory Summit in Utah, represented not just an engineering achievement, but a political statement, a declaration that the country stretched from ocean to ocean, that distance could be conquered, that settlement and commerce could follow the rails into the territories that had seemed remote, inaccessible, beyond the practical reach of civilization. The locomotives that hauled trains across America were different from their British cousins, adapted to local conditions, to steeper grades and sharper curves, to lighter rails and rougher roadbeds. American engines featured cow catchers to clear debris from the tracks, large headlamps for night running through unsettled country, and distinctive styling, bright paint and polished brass. Names and numbers proudly displayed, each locomotive an individual, a personality, not just a machine, but a character in the drama of expansion. And as railways spread, as they became familiar, almost mundane, their revolutionary nature could be overlooked, easy to forget that within a living memory, travel had been limited to the speed of horses, that what the railway enabled, this casual traversing of distance, would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations, the ability to travel 100 miles in a few hours, to cross entire countries in days rather than weeks, represented a fundamental break with all previous human experience of space and time. The late 19th century saw locomotives grow larger still, more powerful, capable of hauling longer trains, heavier loads, freight locomotives with many driving wheels for traction, passenger locomotives with large drivers for speed, specialized designs for mountain grades, for suburban service, for switching in yards, the locomotive evolving into many forms, each adapted to particular tasks, particular conditions, and the technology continued to advance. compound expansion, using steam multiple times at decreasing pressures, extracting more work from each pound of coal burned, superheating, raising steam temperature beyond what was produced in the boiler, increasing efficiency, these refinements making locomotives more economical, more capable, though always within the same basic paradigm, the steam locomotive, burning coal or later oil, boiling water to produce steam, using that steam's expansion to drive pistons, to turn wheels, to pull trains along rails of iron and later steel. But even as steam reached its peak, even as the locomotives became magnificent machines, powerful and fast and beautifully engineered, the seeds of their obsolescence were being planted. Electric locomotives appeared in the late 1800s, drawing power from overhead wires or third rails, clean, quiet, instantly responsive, and diesel engines, internal combustion machines burning oil rather than coal, began to be adapted for railway use, offering advantages in efficiency, in maintenance, in operational flexibility. The transition would be gradual. Steam locomotives would remain dominant well into the 20th century, in some places into the 1960s and even 70s. But the era of steam, the age that had begun with Trevithick and Stephenson, was slowly drawing to a close. Diesel and electric traction proving superior in most applications, more economical, more suited to the demands of modern railway operation. And yet, the steam locomotive, even in retirement, even as museum pieces or heritage railway attractions, retained a hold on the imagination. Something about the visible operation, the smoke and steam, the rhythm of the exhaust, the sense of fire and water transformed into motion, spoke to something deep, a fascination with power made manifest, with human ingenuity wrestling the elements into service. The story of the locomotive is, in many ways, the story of the 19th century itself, of industrialization, of the transformation of society from agricultural and craft-based to urban and mechanized, of the acceleration of life, the compression of distance, the creation of networks that bound nations and continents into single systems of commerce and communication, from those early experimental engines, unreliable and crude, to the magnificent express locomotives of the early 20th century, capable of sustained speeds over 100 miles per hour, represented less than a century of development, an astonishingly rapid evolution driven by competition, by economic incentive, by the accumulated knowledge of thousands of engineers and craftsmen, each contributing improvements, refinements, solutions to the endless challenges of making these machines more powerful, more reliable, more economical, and in that development, in that rapid transformation of technology and society, we can see patterns that would repeat: the initial skepticism giving way to enthusiasm, the infrastructure adapting to accommodate the new technology, the social and economic structures reorganizing around new possibilities, the landscape itself transformed, scarred by cuttings and embankments, bridged by viaducts, tunneled through mountains, all to create smooth paths for wheels of iron carrying their heavy loads. The locomotive changed what it meant to travel, what it meant to send goods to market, what it meant to live in one place and work in another. It made suburbs possible, made fresh food available year-round in cities, made tourism accessible to the middle classes, made migration easier, both within countries and between them. It was both servant and shaper of the industrial age, responding to its needs while simultaneously creating new possibilities, new patterns of life and commerce that hadn't existed before, couldn't have existed before. These machines made them real. And perhaps what's most striking when we consider the locomotive from this distance is how thoroughly it represented a shift in human relationship with power itself. For millennia, power had meant muscle, human or animal, or it had meant natural forces harnessed passively, wind filling sails, water turning wheels, forces borrowed but not fundamentally transformed. But the locomotive, the steam engine more broadly, represented something different. The deliberate, controlled, sustained conversion of chemical energy into mechanical work. Humans learning to unlock the ancient sunlight stored in coal, to release it not in a single burst like gunpowder, but gradually, continuously, under control, feeding it into motion, into the turning of wheels, into useful work performed hour after hour, day after day. This was alchemy of a sort, not the medieval dream of turning lead to gold, but something perhaps more profound, turning heat into motion, understanding the principles deeply enough to design vessels that could contain the pressures, mechanisms that could channel the forces, systems that could regulate and sustain the process without destroying themselves in the attempt. And in learning to do this, in mastering steam, engineers were also learning thermodynamics, the science of heat and energy. Even before the formal laws were articulated, they were discovering through trial and error, through careful measurement and observation, the principles that govern how energy flows, how efficiency can be improved, how waste can be minimized. Practical knowledge preceding theoretical understanding, hands teaching minds. The locomotive embodied paradoxes. It was both powerful and fragile, capable of pulling tremendous loads yet vulnerable to mechanical failure. A cracked cylinder, a leaking valve, a worn bearing could disable a machine that otherwise seemed almost invincible. And so reliability became as important as power, consistency as valuable as peak performance. The machine that worked day after day, year after year, proving more useful than one that achieved spectacular results, but frequently failed. There was beauty in them too, not always recognized in their working days when they were simply tools, machines doing jobs, but beauty nonetheless in the proportion of driving wheels to boiler, in the arrangement of motion, connecting rods and valve gear, moving in precise choreography, every component serving its function while creating patterns of movement that please the eye, function and form unified, engineering as a kind of sculpture, though sculpture that happened to move, to breathe steam, to pull trains across continents, and the sounds, the particular music of steam locomotion, the chuff of exhaust synchronized with wheel rotation, varying in tempo as speed increased or decreased, the hiss of steam escaping from cylinders, the clank of couplings taking up slack, the whistle, that distinctive voice announcing approach, warning of crossings, expressing in its variations something almost like emotion, triumph, warning, farewell, each whistle unique, each locomotive recognizable by those who knew them, by the engine men who spent their working lives in intimate contact with these machines. For there was a craft to operating a locomotive, a skill that went beyond simply understanding the controls. Experienced engine men could feel their machine, sense when something wasn't quite right, hear in the exhaust note or the rhythm of motion that a bearing was running hot or a valve needed adjustment. They knew their engines individually, knew how this particular locomotive liked to be fired, how that one needed careful handling on curves, knowledge that came from hours and years of experience, of attention paid to the subtle variations that made each machine unique despite superficial similarity. And the firemen who shoveled coal into fireboxes learned to read the fire, to know when it needed fresh fuel, where to place the coal for even burning, how to maintain steam pressure through varying demands, climbing grades that required maximum power, descending where steam could be conserved, the firebox, a living thing requiring constant attention, constant feeding, the work physical, demanding, hot, exhausting, but skilled nonetheless, an art developed through practice and observation and the tutelage of those who had mastered it before. The railway culture that developed around locomotives was distinct, its own hierarchy, its own traditions, its own vocabulary, a world of enginemen and firemen, of cleaners who maintained the machines between runs, of fitters who repaired them, of shed foremen who supervised operations, of the mystique of the footplate, the locomotive cab, where only the initiated were permitted, where speed and power were controlled, where decisions made in moments could mean the difference between smooth operation and disaster. And disasters there were: boiler explosions, collisions, derailments. The price of power was risk, and the history of railways includes tragedy as well as triumph. Accidents that killed crew and passengers, that destroyed locomotives and infrastructure. And from each disaster, lessons learned, safety systems developed, automatic brakes, block signaling, dead man's controls, the gradual accretion of safeguards that made railway travel safer, more reliable, though never entirely without danger, never entirely predictable, the price of motion through space at speeds nature never intended for human bodies. Yet people accepted these risks, embraced railway travel despite occasional catastrophes, because the benefits were overwhelming: the compression of distance, the accessibility of places formerly remote, the economic opportunities created by cheap, fast transport. These outweighed the dangers, just as people later would accept the risks of automobile travel, of aviation, trading safety for mobility, for the expansion of possibility that rapid transport enables. The locomotive's influence extended beyond transportation. It shaped architecture, great railway stations becoming civic monuments, hotels built near terminals, entire neighborhoods developing around railway works and depots, cities reorganizing themselves around railway access, property values rising near stations, declining in areas the railways bypassed, geography remade by iron roads, and it influenced culture, literature filled with railway journeys, poetry celebrating or lamenting the iron horse, paintings capturing the drama of locomotives in motion, the romance of departure, the melancholy of arrival, the railway becoming symbol, metaphor for progress, for modernity, for the relentless forward movement of industrial civilization, or alternatively, for destruction of pastoral landscapes, for the mechanization of life, for speed pursued at the expense of contemplation, the locomotive meaning different things to different observers, but meaning something to all, too significant, too transformative to ignore. In the quiet of tonight, thinking about these machines, about their rise and their gradual replacement by newer technologies. There's something almost poignant, the way they embodied an entire era, the way their decline marked the end of something, not just a technology, but a relationship with technology, visible, comprehensible, driven by fire and water, by principles a dedicated observer could understand just by watching, unlike the electric motors and diesel engines that replaced them, closed systems, their operation invisible, mysterious, efficient, but less engaging to human imagination. Perhaps that's why preserved steam locomotives, heritage railways, enthusiast groups maintain such dedication to keeping these machines alive, running them on special occasions, maintaining the skills required to operate them, not from nostalgia alone, though nostalgia plays its part, but from recognition that something valuable exists in the direct, visible, almost organic operation of a steam locomotive, the sense of connection between fuel and fire and steam and motion, a chain of causation you can observe, can feel, can understand in your body as well as your mind. The story of the locomotive is complete now, in the sense that its era has passed. The last regular steam operations ended decades ago in most of the world, and yet the story persists in the railways that still crisscross continents, running on the gauges Stephenson standardized, following routes Victorian engineers surveyed, through tunnels they excavated, over viaducts they built, infrastructure that outlasted the technology it was created for, serving new purposes, electric and diesel traction following paths laid down for steam. The locomotive's legacy embedded in landscape, in the very geography of movement, and on still nights, in certain places, you can sometimes hear a whistle, a heritage railway running an excursion, or the echo of memory, or imagination filling the silence, the sound carrying across distance, announcing motion, departure, the endless human impulse to go, to see what lies beyond the horizon, to connect, to trade, to visit, to explore, the locomotive having made that impulse more achievable, more routine, more democratically available than ever before in human history. Steam and iron expanding the radius of possible lives, of achievable dreams, of connections that could be made and maintained across distances that would have divided people in earlier times. The fire burns down eventually. In every firebox, steam pressure drops, wheels roll to a stop, and the crew climbs down from the footplate, their shift complete. But the rails remain, stretching toward horizons, waiting for the next departure, the next journey, the pattern established, the infrastructure enduring, the revolution the locomotive created, irreversible, permanent, woven into the fabric of how we organize ourselves across space, how we think about distance, how we live in a world made smaller, more intimate, more connected by those parallel lines of steel, and the machines that first proved they could be more than tramways for horses, could be arteries of commerce and culture, pathways for the transformation of everything they touched. And so the story rests, not ended but paused. The locomotives mostly still now, preserved, remembered, honored for what they accomplished, for how they changed the world, for the beauty they embodied, for the skills they required, for the era they defined, standing in museums or running occasionally on heritage lines, ambassadors from a vanished age, reminders of what can be achieved when vision meets determination, when engineering serves human needs, when innovation transforms not just technology, but society itself, the locomotive, first machine to move itself, to carry humanity into modernity, to prove that distance could be conquered, time compressed, the world made navigable in ways previously unimaginable, its work complete, its legacy enduring, its story told. The night deepens, and somewhere in memory or imagination, a whistle sounds faint, distant, carrying across years as once it carried across miles. The voice of the locomotive, calling, fading, becoming part of the silence from which it emerged, part of history, part of the long dream of progress and transformation, part of us. There is something almost otherworldly about the glow of a screen in a darkened room, the way light spills across faces turned upward in concentration, the quiet hum of electricity flowing through circuits and chips, carrying with it entire universes of possibility. I find myself thinking tonight about how we learn to play in new ways, how humanity discovered it could build worlds inside machines, worlds made entirely of light and logic and imagination, worlds that existed nowhere except in the dance of electrons through silicon pathways, and yet felt as real as anything we could touch. The story begins in places you might not expect, in research laboratories where massive computers filled entire rooms, their tape reels spinning slowly, their vacuum tubes glowing amber in the dimness, scientists and engineers working late into the evening, not on weapons or calculations or data processing, but on something stranger, something that seemed almost frivolous at the time. They were teaching machines to play. In those early days, before anyone imagined what would come, the very idea seemed peculiar. Computers were serious instruments, built for serious purposes, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, occupying specially cooled rooms in university basements and military installations, and yet there were those who wondered quietly what else these thinking machines might do. The impulse to play is older than our species, older than civilization itself. We see it in every young animal, the way kittens stalk and pounce, the way wolf cubs wrestle and chase. Play is how we learn the rules of our world, how we practice for challenges we cannot yet imagine. And when we built machines that could think, even in the most primitive ways, we almost immediately began to wonder if they too could play. The earliest experiments were simple, almost absurdly so by modern standards, a game of tic-tac-toe rendered in glowing lines on an oscilloscope screen, a simulation of tennis played with paddles that were nothing more than vertical bars of light, a maze navigated by a blinking dot. These were not yet worlds. They were sketches, whispers of possibility, fingers testing the edges of a door that had not yet opened. But there was something magnetic in that simplicity, something that drew people closer to those enormous machines. Scientists would pause in their work to watch. Students would gather. Even people who knew nothing about programming or electronics found themselves captivated by the sight of light responding to intention, a paddle moving because a dial was turned, a dot changing direction because a button was pressed, cause and effect rendered in phosphorescent green or amber glow. The technology was primitive, laughably so, but the feeling it created was not. There was wonder in it, the same wonder that comes from any act of creation, from making something that did not exist before, and more than that, There was interaction, conversation, the machine responding to human input, not just calculating an answer, but creating an experience, a loop of action and reaction that felt almost alive. No one was calling it an industry yet. No one imagined billion-dollar corporations or global competitions or millions of players connected across continents. These were experiments, curiosities, technical demonstrations, ways to show what computers might someday be capable of. And yet, in those flickering displays and simple sounds, in the quiet rooms where researchers leaned close to screens, something fundamental was being born. The idea that we could enter other spaces, not physically, but mentally, that we could extend ourselves into realms that existed only as patterns of electrical charge, that we could compete and explore and solve puzzles in dimensions made of pure mathematics. This was new, genuinely new, a form of play that had never existed before in all of human history. And it arrived quietly, without fanfare, in university labs and research centers, in the minds of people who were supposed to be working on serious things, but who couldn't resist the urge to see what happened when you added a second paddle, or made the ball move faster, or created a simple maze with walls that had to be navigated. Each small addition was a discovery, a step further into territory no one had mapped. The machines themselves were monuments of their era. Steel cabinets and blinking lights, paper tape and magnetic drums, toggle switches in neat rows. Nothing portable, nothing personal. These were institutional devices, shared resources, and yet, even then, even in that age of massive mainframes and batch processing, people were beginning to glimpse something else, a future where these experiences might become smaller, more accessible, more intimate. The first person to see the true potential, to understand that this could be more than demonstration, more than curiosity, was perhaps a man named William Higginbotham, working at Brookhaven National Laboratory in the late 1950s, where he had been tasked with something that seemed simple enough: make the annual Visitors' Day more interesting, show the public what scientists actually did in these mysterious government facilities. He created something he called Tennis for Two, and it appeared on an oscilloscope screen, a small circular display perhaps 5 inches across, showing a side view of a tennis court rendered as a single line, a net in the middle represented by a short vertical dash, and a ball that arced according to actual physics, gravity pulling it down, momentum carrying it forward. Players turned knobs to adjust the angle of their shots and pressed buttons to send the ball flying across that glowing green line. It existed for 2 days, maybe 3, during those autumn open houses in 1958 and 1959, and then it was dismantled. The equipment returned to its original purposes. Higginbotham never patented it, never imagined it might be worth something. It was just a demonstration, a way to show that computers could calculate trajectories in real time, could simulate physical laws, could respond instantly to human input. But the people who played it, they stood in line. They waited their turn. They played again and again. Something about that simple interaction, the satisfaction of timing a shot correctly, the challenge of outmaneuvering an opponent, the pure pleasure of cause and effect rendered in light, it captured something fundamental about what play could become in this new medium. Around the same time, in different laboratories, other minds were exploring similar territory. At MIT, a place that would become legendary for its contributions to interactive computing. Students were gathering around a machine called the PDP-1, a computer that was revolutionary not for its power but for its accessibility. It had a screen, a cathode ray tube display, and it could respond quickly enough to create the illusion of real-time interaction. A young programmer named Steve Russell, working late nights as students did, as they still do, began to imagine something more elaborate than tennis or tic-tac-toe. He imagined spaceships, dogfighting in the void, influenced by the science fiction he loved, the stories of A.E. Doc Smith with their lens-wielding heroes and spectacular space battles. He began to code. The result was Space War, and it took him months to create. Months of typing instructions on paper tape, debugging, refining. Other students contributed. One added a star field in the background. Another programmed a gravity well, a sun in the center of the screen that pulled the ships toward it, creating danger, adding strategy, forcing players to use gravity itself as a weapon or a hazard to avoid. By 1962, it was finished, or as finished as these things ever were, because it kept evolving, kept growing. Other programmers added features, improved the physics, refined the controls. It spread from machine to machine. Anywhere there was a PDP-1, someone would eventually install Space War, and people would gather to play. It was beautiful in its way. Those white lines against black, two ships rendered as simple triangles, torpedoes as bright dots streaking across the void, the star in the center pulling everything toward destruction. Players had to think in curves, in orbital mechanics, had to time their shots while managing their limited fuel and weapons. It was pure skill, pure challenge, and it was mesmerizing. The fact that it ran on a computer worth over $100,000, the equivalent of millions today, made it absurd, impractical, a waste of expensive processing time, and yet it persisted, it survived, because the people who had access to these machines, the researchers and students and engineers, they couldn't resist. They would play during lunch breaks, late at night, whenever the machine wasn't needed for serious work. They held tournaments, developed strategies, became experts at navigating those simple vectors. This was the pattern that would repeat again and again. The technology created for other purposes, for calculation or simulation or data processing, but immediately colonized by the human desire to play, to compete, to master systems and explore possibilities. The impulse was too strong to suppress, too fundamental to ignore. Through the 1960s, these experiments multiplied, remained scattered, confined to universities and research institutions. There was no way for ordinary people to access them, no commercial market, no distribution system. They existed in isolated pockets, passed from programmer to programmer like folklore, like songs taught by ear. But something was changing in the wider world of computing. The machines were getting smaller, not small, but smaller. About transistors replaced vacuum tubes. Integrated circuits began to replace individual transistors, and the cost, slowly, painfully slowly, began to drop, and the accessibility began to rise. A handful of visionaries began to imagine something radical. Computers that individuals could own, that could sit on desks instead of filling rooms, that could be interactive instead of batch processed, that could respond immediately to human input. This seemed like fantasy to most. Computers were institutional tools, serious instruments. But the dreamers persisted. In the late 1960s, a man named Ralph Baer, working at a defense contractor, began to think about television sets, about the fact that in America they sat in living rooms, glowing several hours each evening, displaying images broadcast from distant stations, and he wondered, what if they could display other things? What if they could become interactive? What if you could play games on them? His supervisors were skeptical. This wasn't what the company did. Wasn't related to defense contracts or military applications. But Baer was persistent. He built prototypes in secret at first, then with grudging permission, creating circuits that could generate simple shapes on a screen, that could move those shapes in response to player input, that could detect collisions, could keep score. By 1968, he had a working demonstration about a brown box, it was called, because of its wood grain exterior, and it could play several different games, chase games, tennis games, shooting games where players aimed light guns at targets on the screen. It was crude, simple, but it worked. And more importantly, it was fun, genuinely entertaining in a way that felt different from anything else. Bayer shopped it to television manufacturers. Most weren't interested. They made television, not toys, not game machines, but eventually Magnavox saw potential. They licensed the technology, refined it, prepared it for commercial release. And in 1972, they introduced the Magnavox Odyssey, the first home video game console, the first device designed specifically to let people play electronic games in their living rooms. It was expensive, $100, equivalent to several hundred today, and it required attachments, plastic overlays that stuck to the television screen to provide color and graphics that the system itself couldn't generate. The games were simple, extraordinarily simple, dots and lines moving on a black background, but it sold, not spectacularly, but it sold, proving that there was an appetite, a market for this new form of entertainment. That same year, 1972, a different revolution was beginning in a different place. Nolan Bushnell, a young engineer who had played Space War at university, who understood its appeal, who saw its potential, founded a company called Atari, a name borrowed from the Japanese game Go, meaning a state where a stone or group of stones is about to be captured. His first product was a simple game, inspired by the tennis games that had come before, but refined, perfected, reduced to absolute purity. 2 paddles, 1 ball, a dotted line down the middle representing a net, and the simple instruction on the cabinet, avoid missing ball for high score. He called it Pong, and it changed everything. The first prototype was installed in a bar in Sunnyvale, California, a small tavern called Andy Capp's, and within days the machine stopped working, not because it was broken, but because the coin box was so full of quarters that it jammed the mechanism. People were lining up to play, feeding coins into the machine over and over. The simplicity was the appeal. Anyone could understand it immediately, but mastering it, developing the reflexes and timing and strategy, that took practice. Bushnell realized he had discovered something, not just a game, but a business model, arcade machines, coin-operated entertainment, placed in public spaces, bars and pizza parlors and bowling alleys, and eventually dedicated arcades, places where people would come specifically to play, feeding quarter after quarter into machines, chasing high scores, competing with strangers. The arcade era was beginning, though no one called it that yet. Atari began manufacturing Pong machines as fast as they could, and they still couldn't keep up with demand. Other companies saw the success and rushed to create their own versions, their own games. The technology was simple enough that small manufacturers could enter the market, and suddenly there was an industry, raw and chaotic and exploding with energy. These early arcade games had a quality that's hard to explain to those who never experienced them. They were physical objects, wooden cabinets with artwork, with coin slots and start buttons, with joysticks that had weight and resistance, with screens that glowed in darkened rooms. They made sounds, beeps and boops synthesized from simple circuits that echoed in the spaces where they lived. And they were social, communal. You played them in public or with witnesses, with an audience of people waiting their turn or simply watching. The golden age of the arcade arrived quietly at first, then all at once, through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. When walking into a darkened arcade meant entering a space of pure sensation, the cacophony of dozens of machines competing for attention, each one calling out with its own distinctive sounds, the electronic warbles of Space Invaders, the waka, waka, waka of Pac-Man, the missile explosions of Missile Command, all blending into a symphony of synthetic noise. The carpet was always dark, patterned to hide stains, and the lighting was dim, partly to save money, partly to make the screens more visible, but also because it created an atmosphere, a sense of stepping out of the ordinary world into somewhere else, somewhere that operated by different rules, where your worth was measured in high scores and extra lives, where quarters were the currency of dreams. Space Invaders arrived in 1978 from Japan, created by a designer named Tomohiro Nishikado, and it introduced something that would become fundamental to the medium, a sense of overwhelming odds, of inevitable defeat. The aliens marched down the screen in formation, left, right, and with each row you destroyed, the remaining ones moved faster, the tension building, the music accelerating, that four-note bass line becoming more frantic as the invaders descended. Players hid behind barriers that slowly eroded under enemy fire, learning to peek out and shoot, to time their movements, to aim for the flying saucer that crossed the top of the screen for bonus points. And when the last invader was destroyed, the next wave began. Harder, faster. There was no winning, only surviving as long as skill and reflexes allowed, and then entering your initials on the high score table, 3 letters to represent your achievement, your proof that you had been there, had played, had excelled. The game caused a shortage of 100 yen coins in Japan, or so the legend goes, whether literally true or not. It captured something real about the game's impact, its addictive quality, the way people would play again and again, chasing the feeling of that perfect run, that moment when reflexes and strategy aligned and the invaders fell in satisfying cascades. Asteroids came in 1979 with vector graphics instead of raster, meaning the images were drawn with bright lines instead of pixels, giving everything a crisp, geometric beauty. You piloted a small triangular ship through a field of tumbling asteroids, shooting them into smaller and smaller fragments, each shot splitting them, creating more hazards even as you cleared the screen. And when all the asteroids were gone, More appeared, larger, faster. The physics felt real, or real enough. Momentum carried you forward. Rotation happened smoothly. You could thrust and coast, could use gravity or its absence. The game rewarded spatial thinking, the ability to predict trajectories, to position yourself for the next shot while avoiding the current threats. And it introduced a panic button hyperspace that would teleport you to a random location, possibly to safety, possibly into instant death, a desperate gamble when all other options were exhausted. But it was Pac-Man, arriving in 1980, that transcended the medium. That became something more than a game, became a cultural phenomenon, appeared on lunchboxes and Saturday morning cartoons, inspired a top 40 song, Pac-Man Fever, that actually charted, became something your parents and grandparents recognized, even if they'd never played. Toru Iwatani designed it to appeal beyond the young men who dominated arcades, created something nonviolent, colorful, approachable, a yellow circle that ate dots in a maze, pursued by 4 ghosts, each with its own behavior pattern, its own personality. Blinky was aggressive, always chasing. Pinky tried to position herself ahead of you. Inky was unpredictable. Clyde seemed almost random. Learning these patterns, understanding how to manipulate them, was the key to mastery. The game had rhythm. Moving through the maze became almost musical, the waka waka sound of Pac-Man eating dots, creating a steady beat. And then the moment of reversal when you ate a power pellet, and the ghosts turned blue and fled, and you chased them, the hunter becoming the hunted for just a few precious seconds before the cycle began again. Arcades multiplied, appeared in shopping malls and bowling alleys, in dedicated spaces that smelled of carpet cleaner and cigarette smoke, where teenagers gathered after school, where some players became legendary, known for their ability to play a single quarter for hours, to rack up scores that seemed impossible, to perform techniques that others would gather around to watch, to witness. The machines themselves were works of art, each cabinet decorated with elaborate painted artwork, airbrushed scenes of space battles or fantasy landscapes, of the characters and scenarios from the game. The art was often more detailed than anything the game itself could display, creating a promise, an aspiration, showing what your imagination should add to those simple pixels and sounds. Donkey Kong appeared in 1981, Nintendo's first major success in America, and it introduced something new, a narrative, however simple, a story told through the gameplay itself. A carpenter named Jumpman, later renamed Mario, trying to rescue his girlfriend from a giant ape who had climbed a construction site. The game had multiple screens of different challenges, ladders to climb and barrels to jump, and when you rescued the girl, the ape climbed higher, started the cycle again, harder, faster. The designer, Shigeru Miyamoto, understood something about character and personality, even with the limited graphics available. Just a few pixels, he created figures that felt alive, that had weight and momentum, that jumped and ran in ways that felt satisfying, responsive. The controls were tight, precise. When you died, it felt like your fault, not the game cheating, and that made you want to try again, to do better, to prove you could master it. Dragon's Lair arrived in 1983 like a vision from the future, using Laserdisc technology to display actual animation, hand-drawn by former Disney animator Don Bluth, It looked like nothing else in the arcade. Full-screen cartoon graphics, smooth movement, cinematic scenes. Players gasped when they first saw it, crowded around the cabinet to watch. Even if they weren't playing, but it was essentially an elaborate timing game, a series of quick-time events. You watched the animation and pressed the joystick in the right direction at the right moment, or pressed the sword button to attack. Success meant seeing the next scene. Failure meant an elaborate death animation, and there were many ways to die. The game was punishingly difficult, each play rarely lasting more than a minute. Quarters vanished quickly, but that animation, those fluid movements, that cinematic quality, it showed where the technology might go, even if the gameplay itself was limited. Meanwhile, in homes, a different revolution was unfolding. The Atari 2600 had launched in 1977, a home console that used interchangeable cartridges, meaning you could buy new games, build a library, weren't limited to whatever was built into the machine. It was brilliant, revolutionary, and it sold millions. The games were simpler than their arcade counterparts. The 2600 was not powerful. Its graphics were blocky, abstract, but it brought the experience home, let you play as much as you wanted without feeding quarters, let you practice, improve, master games in private before facing them in public, and for children for whom arcade visits were limited by parental permission and available money. It was a gateway to unlimited play. Activision formed in 1979, the first third-party game developer, founded by former Atari programmers who wanted credit for their work, wanted their names on the games they created. Atari had treated programmers as anonymous, interchangeable, but these developers knew their work had value, had artistry. They began making games for Atari's console without Atari's permission, and when Atari sued, Activision won, establishing the right of independent developers to create software for existing platforms. This opened floodgates. Suddenly, dozens of companies were making games for the 2600. The quality varied wildly. Some were excellent. Pitfall, with its jungle exploration and precise jumping, River Raid with its scrolling terrain and fuel management. Others were rushed, poorly conceived, cynical cash grabs, trading on popular movies or concepts, and the market began to flood, to saturate. Too many games, too many bad games, confusion setting in. The home computer revolution was arriving simultaneously. The Apple II, the Commodore 64, the Atari 400 and 800, machines that could play games but could also program, could word process, could theoretically justify their cost as educational, as useful. Parents who would never buy a game console might buy a computer, and game developers eagerly created software for these platforms. These computer games could be more complex, had more memory, more storage via floppy disks. They could save progress, could have deeper mechanics, longer experiences. Games like Ultima and Wizardry created vast fantasy worlds to explore, with statistics and inventory and quests, experiences that unfolded over dozens of hours, that required mapping on graph paper, taking notes, investing real time and thought. Zork and its sequels brought text adventures to prominence, games with no graphics at all, just descriptions. You are in a maze of twisty little passages all alike, and you typed commands. Go north, take lamp, examine mailbox. The parser was limited, often frustrating, but when it worked, when the game understood your intent, When you solved a puzzle through logic and experimentation, the satisfaction was profound. You were using language itself as the interface, your imagination creating all the visuals. The crash came in 1983, sudden and catastrophic. The North American video game market collapsed under its own weight. Too many consoles, too many bad games, too many disappointed customers who bought expensive cartridges based on movie licenses or popular brands, only to find broken, unplayable, joyless experiences. Retailers returned up millions of unsold units. Companies went bankrupt overnight. The industry seemed finished, a fad that had burned bright and died. E.T., the extraterrestrial, became the symbol of the crash. A game rushed to market in just 5 weeks to capitalize on the movie, programmed by a single developer working impossible hours, released for the Christmas season of 1982, and it was nearly unplayable, confusing, frustrating. Millions of copies were manufactured based on the movie's popularity, and most went unsold, eventually buried in a landfill in New Mexico, a literal burial of the industry's excess and hubris. But while America mourned, while retailers cleared their shelves of gaming products, while industry experts declared the video game a dead medium, something else was happening across the Pacific. In Japan, Nintendo was preparing something different, something that would change everything again. The Famicom launched in Japan in 1983, the family computer, designed to be affordable, reliable, and coupled with games of genuine quality. Shigeru Miyamoto's understanding of game design, of what made play satisfying, was embedded in the system's flagship titles, and when it came to America 2 years later, rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System, it was positioned carefully, not as a game console. Retailers wouldn't stock game consoles, but as an entertainment system, a toy, something different. It came with a robot, ROB, the robotic operating buddy, and a light gun, the Zapper, accessories that made it seem novel, innovative, not just another game machine. And the initial games were carefully chosen, limited in number, high in quality. Super Mario Bros. Launched with the system, and it was a revelation. Mario ran from left to right across scrolling levels, the screen moving smoothly, revealing new challenges, new secrets, hidden blocks that contained coins or power-ups, warp pipes that led to underground bonus rooms. The first time you found a hidden passage, discovered a secret area. The game rewarded exploration, curiosity. It wasn't just about reaching the end, it was about discovering everything along the way. The controls felt perfect. Mario accelerated when you held the button, jumped higher if you held it longer, had momentum and weight. Running and jumping became a rhythm, a dance. The game taught through design rather than instruction, the first level introducing each concept naturally, letting you learn by doing. And when you died, and you would die often, you started the level again, immediate, no waiting, just try again, do better. Nintendo understood curation, controlled their platform carefully, required developers to meet quality standards, limited how many games each company could release per year. Their seal of approval on each cartridge became a promise, a guarantee of basic functionality, of actual game design. This wasn't the Wild West of the Atari era. This was a carefully managed ecosystem. The Legend of Zelda arrived in 1986, and it expanded what console games could be. a vast overworld to explore, dungeons hidden across the landscape, no linear path, no single way forward. You could go almost anywhere from the start, some areas too dangerous, some secrets too obscure, but the freedom was intoxicating. The sense of being an adventurer in an actual world, not just moving through predetermined levels. It came with a gold cartridge, special, different from the standard gray, and it had a battery inside, allowing you to save your progress, to turn off the system and return later to the same point in your journey. This seems trivial now, expected, but then it was transformative. Games could be longer, more complex, could respect your time, your investment. Metroid followed, with its atmosphere of isolation and mystery, exploring alien caverns, no friendly characters, no safe havens, just you and the hostile environment, and the revelation at the end, if you finished quickly enough, that the armored bounty hunter you'd been playing was a woman, Samus Aran, in an era when game protagonists were almost universally male. This was quiet revolution, representation without announcement. The late 1980s saw an explosion of creativity, developers understanding the medium better, pushing against its limitations. Final Fantasy told elaborate stories with turn-based combat. Mega Man offered non-linear level selection and abilities stolen from defeated bosses. Castlevania created gothic atmosphere with just a few colors and simple sprites, each game finding its own identity, its own way of using the constraints creatively. Sega entered the market with the Genesis, positioned as the cooler alternative. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. The ads proclaimed, targeting older players, teenagers who wanted something edgier, faster. Sonic the Hedgehog became their mascot, designed specifically to show off the Genesis's processing speed, levels that scrolled at velocity, loops and curves and springs launching you through elaborate landscapes, the antithesis of Mario's careful platforming, all momentum and attitude. The bit wars began, 16 bits versus 8, each new system promising more colors, more sounds, more detail. The Super Nintendo arrived with Mode 7 graphics that could rotate and scale the playing field, creating pseudo three-dimensional effects. F-Zero racing through futuristic tracks that seemed to have real depth, real perspective. Star Fox rendering actual polygons, true 3 dimensions, simple and angular, but undeniably the future. Japan was producing role-playing games of increasing sophistication. Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy and Phantasy Star, creating epic narratives, parties of characters developing over dozens of hours, worlds to explore, stories with actual emotional weight, Chrono Trigger with its time travel and multiple endings, Final Fantasy VI with its ensemble cast and apocalyptic stakes. These weren't just games anymore. They were journeys, commitments, experiences that stayed with you. The arcade was changing, evolving. Fighting games became the new center of competitive play. Street Fighter II arrived in 1991 and created a phenomenon. 6 buttons and a joystick controlling elaborate martial artists, each with unique moves, special attacks performed with specific controller motions, quarter circle forward and punch for a fireball, Dragon Punch requiring precise timing. The skill ceiling was enormous. Professional players could perform combos that seemed superhuman, linking attacks in ways that required frame-perfect timing. Arcades became gathering places for serious competition, players challenging each other, money on the table, reputations built and destroyed, the social element reaching new heights. You could learn by watching, by studying the techniques of better players, by asking questions, by joining a community that existed in physical space, in specific locations, arcades in specific neighborhoods becoming known for their talent, their scene. Mortal Kombat pushed violence to new extremes, digitized actors instead of sprites, performing moves that ended with elaborate fatalities, ways to finish your opponent with exaggerated gore. It was controversial, led to Senate hearings, to the creation of the ESRB rating system, but it also showed the medium maturing, dealing with adult themes, even if sometimes crudely, even if sometimes just for shock value. Home computers were becoming more powerful. CD-ROM drives allowing for full motion video, for orchestral soundtracks, for voice acting. Myst arrived in 1993 with its pre-rendered graphics, its point-and-click exploration of a mysterious island, its puzzles that required actual note-taking, actual thought. It sold millions, became the best-selling PC game of its era, proved that games could be contemplative, slow-paced, beautiful in a painterly way. Doom launched the same year, and it was the opposite of contemplative, first-person movement through three-dimensional corridors, shooting demons from hell with an escalating arsenal, fast, violent, visceral, and it included multiplayer, letting you connect computers over networks, over phone lines, and compete or cooperate. This was revolutionary, the beginning of online play as a standard feature, as an expectation. The technology was accelerating, graphics improving rapidly. PlayStation arrived in 1994, dedicated to three-dimensional gaming, discs instead of cartridges, allowing for larger games, more content. Final Fantasy VII in 1997, with its pre-rendered backgrounds and polygon characters, its story spanning 3 discs, its cinematics that seemed almost like film, the line between game and other media blurring. Nintendo responded with the Nintendo 64, truly three-dimensional worlds, Mario exploring castle grounds and painting worlds, Zelda finally in 3 dimensions, with Ocarina of Time, C-button camera control and Z-targeting, systems that would become standard, but at the time felt innovative, solutions to problems that three-dimensional gaming created. How do you orient yourself? How do you keep track of enemies? How do you make combat work when you can move in any direction? The strange thing about technological evolution, about the way these digital worlds grew more complex and detailed, is how the fundamental appeal never changed. Whether you were moving a paddle to intercept a square pixel or piloting a photorealistic spacecraft through a rendered galaxy, the core experience remained the same. The challenge, the mastery, the satisfaction of improving, of understanding systems and exploiting them, of imposing your will on a small pocket of reality that followed consistent rules. There's something deeply human in this, the desire to enter spaces where cause and effect are predictable, where practice leads to improvement, where the chaos of existence is replaced temporarily with logic and pattern in the real world. Effort doesn't always correlate with reward. Skill doesn't guarantee success. But in these created spaces, these rule-bound universes, there was fairness, difficulty, But fairness, the evolution continued, relentless, massively multiplayer games creating persistent worlds where thousands played simultaneously. World of Warcraft launching in 2004 and becoming a cultural touchstone, a place where people met, formed friendships, fell in love, spent thousands of hours not because they were addicted, though some were, but because they found community, purpose, identity. Raids requiring coordination between 40 players, each performing specific roles, succeeding or failing as a group. Motion controls arrived with the Wii. Suddenly, your grandmother was playing virtual bowling. Your parents were trying virtual tennis. The barrier of complex controllers removed, replaced with intuitive gestures. Swing the remote like a racket, like a golf club, like a sword. Millions who had never considered gaming found themselves playing, found it accessible, fun, the industry expanding beyond its traditional audience, beyond young men in darkened rooms. Mobile gaming exploded with smartphones. Suddenly everyone had a gaming device in their pocket. Casual games, puzzle games, Angry Birds and Candy Crush reaching hundreds of millions of players. People who would never buy a console, never consider themselves gamers, playing on buses, in waiting rooms, in stolen moments. The definition of what gaming could be expanding, fragmenting, becoming everything and anything. Independent developers found new platforms. Digital distribution, meaning you didn't need a publisher, didn't need to convince a corporation to manufacture cartridges. You could create something in your bedroom, release it to the world. Minecraft starting as one person's project, spreading through word of mouth, becoming one of the best-selling games ever made. Its blocky aesthetic, its creative freedom, its lack of explicit goals, letting players define their own purposes, build their own stories. Virtual reality arrived, stumbled, arrived again, each iteration more convincing, more immersive, the promise of actually being inside the game world, not watching a screen, but wearing the environment, looking around by moving your head, reaching out and interacting with your hands. The technology still imperfect, still limited, but improving, showing glimpses of what might come, of presence, of embodiment in digital space. Esports grew from arcade competitions to stadium events, professional players earning millions, tournaments broadcast to audiences of millions more. The stigma of gaming as childish or wasteful slowly eroding. Recognition that the skills required, the reflexes and strategy and teamwork were legitimate, valuable, worth celebrating, worth compensating. The stories games told became more sophisticated, more ambitious. The Last of Us, exploring love and loss and moral ambiguity. Red Dead Redemption 2, creating a world of overwhelming detail and melancholy beauty. Thousands of individual animations, weather systems and ecosystems, characters with routines and relationships, the line between authored narrative and emergent experience blurring, becoming irrelevant. And yet, through all of this evolution, through all these technological leaps and market expansions, something remained constant. The same thing that made people line up to play tennis for two on that tiny oscilloscope screen. The same thing that kept MIT students playing Space War when they should have been studying the fundamental pleasure of interaction, of agency, of making choices and seeing consequences, of getting better at something that seemed impossible at first. The medium had grown from curiosity to industry, from niche interest to cultural mainstream, from simple diversions to complex art, but at its heart, at the very core of what made it compelling, was the basic human desire to play, to explore, to master, to exist for a while in spaces where the rules made sense, where improvement was possible, where you could try again, could always try again. These worlds made of light and mathematics, of pixels and polygons, of carefully crafted systems and emergent behaviors. They had become part of human culture, part of how we tell stories, part of how we connect, part of how we play, and the strange thing, the remarkable thing, is that it all started with scientists and engineers wondering what their massive calculating machines might do besides calculate, whether these thinking devices might also dream, might also play, in the quiet of a darkened arcade, now rare, nostalgic spaces. You can still hear echoes of that first wonder, the electronic sounds of Space Invaders and Pac-Man mixing with modern titles, the clack of joysticks and the press of buttons, the satisfying tactile feedback of physical controls, and if you stand there long enough, watching light dance across screens, watching players lean forward in concentration, you can feel the through line, the connection between then and now, between the simplest games and the most complex, between individual moments and the vast sweep of this strange new medium. The glow of screens has become part of our landscape. Consoles beneath televisions, computers on desks, phones in pockets, handheld devices on trains and planes. The ability to enter other worlds to play is always available now, always accessible. What once required finding specific machines in specific places, feeding them quarters, hoping no one else was playing, is now ubiquitous, expected, ordinary in a way that would have seemed miraculous to those early pioneers. And perhaps that's the real transformation, not the graphics or the processing power or the online connectivity, though all of those matter, but the shift from extraordinary to ordinary, from special occasion to everyday occurrence, from expensive novelty to expected feature of modern life. Gaming stopped being something you did and became something that simply was, a medium among media, an art form among art forms, a way of experiencing stories and challenges and beauty and connection. The history is still being written, still unfolding, virtual worlds growing larger, more persistent, more convincing, artificial intelligence creating opponents and allies that feel almost alive, almost real, technology pushing toward experiences we can't quite imagine yet, but that we know are coming, the same way those early programmers knew, somehow, that they were building something important, even when they were just making simple games, just experimenting, just playing. There's poetry in that progression, in the arc, from oscilloscope tennis to virtual reality, from one blip and one line to entire universes rendered in real time, from solitary tinkering to global industry, from hobby to art form, all because people couldn't resist the urge to make machines play, to see what happened when you gave silicon the ability to respond, to create feedback loops between human intention and digital reaction. And so the screens still glow in living rooms and bedrooms, in arcades and museums, in pockets and on wrists, carrying forward that original impulse, that first spark of curiosity about what computing might become if we let it play, if we taught it to dream alongside us, if we used it not just to calculate and process, but to create spaces where we could be different, be better, be anything, even if just for a little while, even if just in worlds made of light, fading now softly into the gentle darkness, where all stories eventually rest, where the glow becomes memory, becomes dream, becomes the quiet satisfaction of games well played and stories well told in the gathering stillness of a long and winding night.